Welcome to Somnia Lore, your place for peaceful, sleepy adventures. Subscribe, hit the bell, like, comment, and share.
The stars above him were trembling again, not the wild kind of trembling that comes from motion, but the soft quiver of something alive, half awake, remembering itself. Rick sat alone in the ship's glass dome, bathed in their distant glow. The hum of the engine was low, steady, like an old friend breathing beside him. A bottle of something half-finished dangled from his fingers. Outside, infinite worlds drifted, yet he stared only at one, the one reflected faintly in the curved glass, his own tired eyes. It's strange, he thought, how even light gets lonely when it travels too far. He turned his head slightly, and there, across the small cabin, Morty was sleeping. The boy's breathing was even, shallow, innocent in a way the universe didn't deserve. A faint flicker of blue light shimmered over his face from the console. His hand twitched once, like he was reaching for something in his dream. Rick almost spoke. Almost. But silence had become his closest habit. You listening out there, you'd understand this kind of quiet. The kind that isn't empty but full of echoes. We love you, truly. You're part of this space too, floating somewhere between thought and dream. Before we begin the story, tell us where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Rick shifted his coat around his shoulders. The leather was worn soft at the edges, like paper folded too many times. A clock somewhere ticked, not because time mattered here, but because he once built it to pretend that it did. He watched the faint glow on Morty's cheek and thought, I've seen this moment in too many timelines, but it never gets easier. Outside, the ship drifted between ribbons of nebula light, clouds of silver gas coiled and uncoiled like dreams exhaling. Somewhere in the distance, a comet passed, leaving behind a streak of dust that sparkled briefly, then vanished into night. The ship's sensors whispered their data, numbers gliding through the air like lullabies for machines. Rick ignored them. His attention was elsewhere, deep, deep inside, where something unnamed had started to stir. There was a time, long ago, when the sound of a sleeping child brought him peace, when he believed he could fix everything that broke, even people. But every genius learns, eventually, that the math of hearts doesn't resolve cleanly. You solve for one and lose another. You build infinity and forget the point of being finite. He took another sip, the taste bitter and metallic. You'd think I'd stop doing this, he muttered to the stars. But then what else am I supposed to do? Talk to God? He smiled faintly, a ghost of sarcasm. I've already outdrunk him twice. Morty turned slightly in his sleep, mumbling a few words. Rick couldn't make out. They sounded like fragments of a dream. Maybe something about home. The word always hit him like a slow punch. Home. He couldn't remember what that meant anymore. Maybe it was never a place. Maybe it was just a moment, half remembered between two adventures. He leaned back in his chair, letting the hum of the ship blend with the rhythm of Morty's breathing. The moment stretched, long and fragile, until even time seemed hesitant to move. He thought about all the other versions of this scene. Other Ricks, other Mortys, sleeping under other stars. Some worlds where they were enemies, some where they never met, some where he never built the portal gun at all. But in this one, right now, there was peace. Small, temporary, undeserved peace. He almost wanted to freeze it, not in science, but in memory. To keep it glowing quietly in the corner of his mind, untouched by what was coming. But even memories decay when you look at them too long. Somewhere behind him, a small device pulsed. It was nothing urgent, just an old sensor flickering with static. But Rick's eyes drifted toward it anyway, watching the light blink, blink, blink. He thought of the first time Morty had seen stars up close, how the boy's eyes widened like two tiny galaxies trying to understand the larger one. That had been the moment Rick knew he'd made a mistake. Not because he brought Morty into danger, but because he'd brought him into wonder. Wonder changes people. It makes them believe in things Rick had long since abandoned. He sighed. You're too good for this, kid. Morty stirred again, murmuring, Huh? What, Rick? Rick froze. The boy didn't wake, though. He just turned onto his side, facing the viewport. His reflection merged with the stars. For a heartbeat, Rick saw both of them out there, infinite, fragile, fading together. It's a strange thing about the universe, how it lets you see your regrets in reflections. They're always softer there, easier to forgive. He looked down at the bottle in his hand and set it gently on the console. The stars outside shimmered brighter as though they too were listening. You know, he whispered, mostly to himself, I built all this, the portals, the dimensions, the endless running, but every time I try to escape something, I just find another version of it waiting. He laughed quietly, not bitterly, but like someone remembering an old song. Maybe the point wasn't to run. Maybe it was to stop long enough to see what followed me here. The hymn of the ship deepened, a low note that seemed to settle in his bones. He reached out and adjusted a dial, but the movement was almost affectionate, like tucking in a child. The lights dimmed to a soft amber glow. Space outside turned darker, quieter, the stars now slow and sleepy. He whispered something then, a word that could have been sorry, or stay, no one would know. The ship translated it into silence. Rick leaned his head back and closed his eyes. For a moment he imagined the stars above him were drops of time, frozen mid-fall, each one holding a story he hadn't told. A truth he hadn't shared. Somewhere in there was the secret, the one he kept from every Morty. The one that began before time began. The one he was almost ready to remember. He didn't plan to dream, but the universe had its ways. When sleep finally came, it didn't come like a fall. It came like a tide. Gentle, reluctant, kind. He drifted into it, the way light drifts into the dark slowly without protest. The dream began the same way it always did, with a door. It wasn't made of metal or science, but of wood. Weathered and cracked, painted blue once upon a time. He reached for the handle, but his hand shook. Behind it he could hear laughter. Small, human laughter. A child's. He hesitated. The sound both beautiful and unbearable. He opened the door anyway. The light on the other side was soft and golden, the kind that belongs to mornings long gone. There was a small kitchen table, 2 mugs, steam curling up like thin threads of memory. And across the table sat a woman, her eyes tired but kind, her smile familiar in a way he didn't want to name. She said something, but the words melted before reaching him. Only the tone stayed warm, forgiving, a melody that made his chest ache. He tried to speak, but the dream folded in on itself, the edges blurring like wet paint. The woman faded, the mugs dissolved. All that remained was the echo of her voice, saying his name like it meant something again. He woke to silence. The hum of the ship returned. The bottle sat where he left it. Morty was still asleep, still dreaming. Whatever young hearts dream. Rick rubbed his eyes and whispered, "Another one gone." Then he looked out at the stars again, those trembling, endless witnesses, and smiled faintly. "Keep this one, okay?" he said to no one in particular. Outside, a faint trail of starlight drifted past, slow as breath. Somewhere in another version of the night. Maybe he was still dreaming. Maybe he never stopped. Maybe even now, he was building something new. Not a portal, not a weapon, but a quiet place where the stars could finally rest. And in that place, maybe Morty would find him again. But not tonight. Tonight, the universe was enough. Tonight, he just watched the stars tremble softly, endlessly, until sleep took him once more. Morning, if such a thing could exist in space, came slowly. The ship didn't wake. It merely exhaled, its lights pulsing faintly to imitate dawn. Morty stirred first. He rubbed his eyes, blinking at the star-smeared glass, then glanced toward Rick, who still sat half-slumped in the pilot's chair, chin tucked to chest, as if the weight of the night had been heavier than gravity itself. The silence between them was warm, comfortable, the kind that grows when words have already been spoken too many times. Morty watched him for a long moment, trying to read the lines of Rick's face. There were more of them now, tiny maps of sleeplessness, tracing decades of unspoken things. Somewhere, deep down, Morty felt a soft ache. He wanted to say something simple, something like thanks, or you looked peaceful for once, but instead he just whispered, "You fell asleep, huh?" Rick's eyelids fluttered, then opened halfway. Yeah, don't make a big deal out of it." His voice was gravelly, his humor half awake. Ship was running itself fine, didn't need me babysitting it. Morty smiled faintly. "You were snoring." "I don't snore," Rick grumbled, rubbing his temples. That was the engine. Calibrating. Sounded human. Morty said. Rick let out a quiet chuckle. "Engine's got feelings too, kid." He reached forward, tapping a few buttons until the ship's hum steadied. "So what? You watching me sleep now?" "That's creepy, even for you." Morty shrugged, still smiling. "You looked peaceful, I guess." The words hung there, gentle and dangerous. Rick's hands paused over the console. He didn't look at Morty, just muttered, "Yeah, well, peaceful's overrated. Usually means something's about to go wrong." Outside, the nebula light shifted color, pale pinks bleeding into soft golds. The illusion of morning stretched across the horizonless void. For a moment, they both sat quietly, staring out. Morty broke the silence first. "Where are we going today?" Rick hesitated, then shrugged. "Nowhere, really? That's kind of the point." Morty frowned. "You always have a destination." "Not today." Rick leaned back, a chair creaking. Sometimes, even a genius needs to drift. Morty thought about that. He didn't understand it. Not completely, but he liked how it sounded. Drift, he repeated softly. Okay. Rick reached into his coat and pulled out a small metallic sphere, no larger than an apple. He turned it over in his hands, the light catching on its surface. You ever wonder what stars smell like? He asked suddenly. Morty blinked. No. They're like burning hydrogen, right? Rick gave a small, lopsided grin. That's the science answer. I mean, the real one. The real one? Yeah. He turned the sphere once more, pressing a hidden switch. It unfolded like petals, revealing a glowing core. The light wasn't harsh. It was soft, warm, like candlelight seen through tears. I made this a long time ago, collected the light from dying stars, just before they went out, condensed it into memory form. Morty's eyes widened. You bottled stars? Rick nodded, kinda. Not their heat or mass, just their last breath. The part that remembers being alive. Morty leaned closer. The glow reflected in his pupils. It's beautiful.
Rick didn't answer. His gaze was far away, past the stars. Somewhere older. I was gonna give it to someone once, he said quietly. Never did.
Morty waited, expecting him to elaborate, but he didn't. Instead, Rick closed the sphere again, its petals folding shut like a secret. Morty wanted to ask who it was for, but he didn't. He'd learned that some questions only break things open that aren't ready to heal. The ship drifted in silence. The sound of the engine filled the spaces between thoughts. After a while, Rick spoke again, softer this time. When I was your age, well, your relative age, I used to follow someone too closely. Morty glanced at him. Like me following you? Worse, Rick said. I thought the closer I got, the more I'd understand them. Thought I could learn their formula, figure out how they worked. People don't work like equations. Morty, they don't balance. You can spend a lifetime chasing someone's orbit and still never touch their gravity. Morty frowned, trying to grasp the weight of it. Is that why you push people away? Rick laughed quietly. Kid, I don't push people away. The universe just expands faster than I can hold on. He reached forward, flicking a switch on the console. A small viewport opened, revealing a drifting planet below, smooth blue and clouded with mist. Looks peaceful, Morty said. It's not real, Rick replied. Just a projection. Memory data stitched from 1,000 dead worlds. Then why show it? Because sometimes, Rick said, his eyes glinting with tired amusement, we need fake peace to remember what real peace felt like. Morty didn't know how to answer that. He just watched the blue clouds swirl below, soft as breath. Rick stood, stretching his arms. The motion cracked faintly, a reminder of how long he'd been carrying his own bones. He walked to the back of the ship, where shelves of forgotten gadgets and trinkets gathered dust. He picked up a small silver wrench, old dented, something handmade. He turned it over thoughtfully. You know, this used to belong to another Morty, one who thought fixing things meant saving them. Morty's chest tightened. What happened to him? Rick set the wrench down gently. He grew up. The words landed heavier than they sounded. Morty looked back out the window, eyes tracing the slow arc of starlight. Do all Mortys grow up? Rick hesitated, then said quietly, only the lucky ones. The hum of the ship deepened again. They drifted past the edge of the projection back into pure black space. Stars glimmered faintly, then vanished into distance. Morty finally broke the silence. You ever wish you could stop at all? Like stop running? Rick's gaze stayed on the stars. Running's not the problem. It's what happens when you stop that scares me. He returned to his chair, sinking into it slowly. For a long time, he said nothing. Morty waited, sensing the heaviness of what lingered unspoken. Then softly, Rick added, when you stop, you remember every face, every version, every moment you left behind. He looked at Morty then, really looked at him, and the softness in his eyes was almost unbearable. That's why I keep moving. Motion blurs the edges. Morty swallowed. But doesn't it get lonely? Rick exhaled, a sound that was neither laugh nor sigh. Always. The ship's lights dimmed again, as if honoring the honesty between them. Outside, space stretched infinitely, silent and forgiving. Morty leaned back, resting his head against the cool metal wall. I don't get you sometimes, Rick. You're not supposed to, Rick said. Understanding ruins the mystery. Morty smiled faintly. You sound like a poet. Rick smirked. Yeah, well, I drink like one too. They shared a quiet laugh. It wasn't loud or cheerful, just human. Small, tired, real. The stars drifted slower now, as though the universe itself was listening. Rick reached into his coat again, pulling out the metallic sphere. He held it up, letting it glow softly between them. Every Morty, he said, teaches me something different. But you remind me that I still have something left to lose. Morty looked at him, eyes glistening with the faint light. That's kind of sad. Rick shook his head. No, kid, that's the closest thing to being alive. He closed the sphere, tucking it away. The silence that followed was warm again, fragile but whole. After a while, Morty's eyes grew heavy. The rhythm of space, the hum of the engine, Rick's low voice, it all blended into a slow lullaby. He drifted, fighting sleep, mumbling, "You'll wake me if something happens, right?" Rick glanced at him, the corner of his mouth lifting. "Nothing's gonna happen tonight, Morty. We're just drifting." Morty nodded, already half dreaming. Good, good. His voice faded, replaced by the sound of even breathing. Rick watched him for a long time. The light from the console flickered across Morty's face, soft as dawn. He looked peaceful again, the kind of peace Rick used to think only existed in equations. He turned back to the stars. They trembled faintly as if remembering his gaze from the night before. Rick whispered, almost to them, "Don't let him dream too far." The stars seemed to listen. The ship drifted on, quiet, endless, wrapped in the heartbeat of galaxies. Somewhere in the black, a forgotten planet shimmered briefly, like a thought passing through a sleeping mind. Then it was gone. Rick closed his eyes, the hum of the ship sinking into his pulse. For the first time in years, he didn't think of running. He just let himself drift beside the boy who still believed in stars. The dream began before Morty even realized he was asleep. He stood in a hallway made of glass, and beneath his feet, entire galaxies turned like marbles in slow motion. The walls shimmered with faint reflections, versions of himself, older, younger, endless. Somewhere ahead, a door glowed faintly blue, pulsing to the rhythm of a heartbeat. He took a hesitant step toward it, hearing only the soft echo of his own breathing. The closer he got, the warmer the air felt, until the light wrapped around him like a memory he couldn't name. Then he heard it, Rick's voice, distant but unmistakable. "Don't open that one, Morty." The words were calm, not warning but weary, like he'd said them 1,000 times before. Morty turned, trying to find him, but the hallway bent in on itself, and the voice dissolved into silence. He woke slowly, the hum of the ship filling his ears again. The stars outside were dimmer now, the void stretching endlessly in all directions. Rick was still at the console, hunched forward, tinkering with something small and metallic. Morty rubbed his eyes and mumbled, "Morning, I guess." Rick didn't look up. It's technically not morning anywhere, but sure, kid. Morning. Morty sat up, winking away the haze of his dream. "You been awake this whole time?" "Didn't feel like sleeping," Rick said. "Sleep's for people who think tomorrow's gonna be different." Morty frowned. "You don't think it can be?" Rick's hands kept moving, delicate and precise, assembling tiny components that clicked softly under his fingers. "Different's just the same story in a new suit," he said. "But I like pretending. Keeps my hands busy." Morty got up and drifted closer, peering over his shoulder. "What are you making?" Rick hesitated before answering. "Something I should have finished a long time ago." On the table sat a small glass bottle. Inside it, faint light swirled, slow liquid, like melted stars. It pulsed gently with each beat of sound in the room as if it were listening. Morty stared, mesmerized. "What is that?" Brock's tone softened. "It's called a bottled universe. My first one." "Your first?" Morty repeated, almost whispering. "You've made more?" "Hundreds," Rick said, still watching the light turn. "Most of them didn't last. You build something infinite and it starts believing it doesn't need you. Kinda like kids, huh?" Morty tilted his head. "Why'd you make it?" Rick leaned back in his chair, sighing, "'Cause I thought I could make something perfect. Something that wouldn't die, wouldn't lie, wouldn't forget me." His eyes flickered toward the glass. "But even perfection learns how to leave." Morty watched the light spin. It was beautiful, too beautiful for the sadness it carried. "So this one still works?" "Yeah," Rick murmured, "because I stopped trying to make it perfect. I just let it be small." He held the bottle up to the dim light, and the glow inside shifted colors, gold, then violet, then soft blue. Morty saw tiny specks moving inside, like dust motes suspended in honey. He leaned closer and gasped. "The stars," Rick finished. "Miniature ones. Self-sustaining microcosm. Whole galaxy spinning in the size of a shot glass. But it's not about the tech, Morty. It's about what it means." "What does it mean?" Rick looked at him for a long moment before saying quietly, "It means I cared too much about something I couldn't keep." Morty frowned, unsure how to answer. The silence stretched again, and the ship's hum seemed almost tender. Finally, he said, "You could have given it to someone. You said you were gonna." Rick nodded. "Yeah, I made it for someone once. Someone who never saw it." "Who?" Rick smirked faintly. "Doesn't matter now. She's probably out there somewhere, orbiting her own mistakes." Morty watched the swirling light again. "You still think about her?" Rick's voice was soft now, almost gentle. "Every time I build something small and fragile." The boy didn't ask more. Some things in Rick's tone weren't meant to be untangled. Instead, he reached out, hesitant, and touched the glass. It was warm. The stars inside seemed to pulse faster, as if responding to him. "It's alive," he whispered. Rick gave a half smile. "Everything that remembers is alive, kid." They sat in silence a while, the light from the bottled universe casting faint reflections on their faces. The ship drifted without direction, and time, whatever that word meant anymore, stretched thin. Morty finally asked, "You ever wish you could go inside one of them?" Rick chuckled. "The sound low?" "I did once. Didn't end well. They worshipped me for a while, then tried to overthrow me. You know how it goes. Creation's a messy gig." Morty looked troubled. "You were their god?" Rick shrugged. "More like their bad parent." The boy frowned, thinking of the tiny world spinning inside the bottle. "Do they know you're out here watching?" Rick's gaze softened. Maybe they feel it. Maybe that's what gravity really is. The universe missing the hands that built it. Morty didn't know what to say to that. He just sat there, eyes fixed on the small glowing bottle, feeling something like awe settle in his chest. After a long pause, Rick spoke again. "When I first made it, I thought it was a cure, a way to hold on to what was slipping away. But all it did was remind me that even beauty needs space to breathe." He set the bottle down carefully as if afraid to wake it. The light inside pulsed once more, then slowed to a steady rhythm, calm like a heartbeat falling asleep. Morty leaned back, arms folded. "You still keep it close." Rick nodded. "It's the only thing I've ever made that didn't ask me to fix it." For a while, they just sat there listening to the ship's quiet song. Morty thought about everything Rick had said, about perfection, loss, gravity, love disguised as creation. He wondered if Rick even realized how much of himself was hidden in that tiny bottle. After a long silence, Morty whispered, "You know, I used to think you built all this stuff because you were bored." Rick smirked faintly. "You're not wrong. But now I think maybe you build things because you're scared of what happens when you stop." Rick looked at him then, really looked, and for once there was no sarcasm in his eyes. "You're learning too fast, Morty. That's dangerous." "Why?" "Because when you start understanding people like me, you start losing the simple parts of yourself. And trust me, those are the parts you'll miss." Morty swallowed, unsure how to respond. He looked down at his hand, small and human against the glowing universe. "Maybe," he said softly. "That's what being with you is, learning to keep what's simple while everything else gets bigger." Rick smiled barely. "That's a good theory. Let's hope you never have to test it." The lights in the cabin dimmed automatically, signaling rest mode. The stars outside drifted slower, their motion almost imperceptible. Morty leaned his head against the wall again, still watching the bottle's soft glow. Rick stood, placing it gently on a small shelf near the viewport. For a moment, it looked like another star among the countless others. "You know what's funny?" he said, voice almost a whisper. "Every time I think I've created something eternal, it ends up teaching me how temporary I am." Morty closed his eyes. "That's kind of sad, Rick." Rick looked out at the infinite night. "Yeah," he said softly, "but it's honest." The hum of the ship deepened, steady and rhythmic like a lullaby sung by the void itself. Morty's breathing slowed. The bottled light flickered once, as if exhaling. Rick stood there for a long time staring at it, at the miniature galaxies turning within, at the reflection of himself split across 1,000 fragile worlds. He reached out, tracing the air beside it, but never touching. Then almost too quietly to hear, he murmured, "Don't outshine him, all right? Just keep him dreaming." The bottle glowed softly in response. Rick turned away, the faintest smile tugging at his mouth. He sank back into his chair, closed his eyes, and let the sound of space fold over him like a blanket. The stars trembled again, not from distance this time, but from recognition. Somewhere within the quiet spin of the bottled universe, a single light pulsed brighter, like a small heartbeat, remembering its maker. And for a fleeting moment, Rick felt it pulse back. The morning, if such a thing existed in deep space, arrived as a quiet flicker through the viewport. The ship's system stirred before Rick did, humming faintly like a sleeping creature turning in its nest. Morty woke first. His eyes opened to the dim blue glow that leaked from the bottled universe on the shelf. For a few seconds, he forgot where he was, his mind still half dreaming of falling through stars that whispered his name. Then the reality of the ship pressed back in. The metallic air, the scent of ozone, and Rick snoring softly in the pilot's chair. He sat up slowly, rubbing his temples. The silence was too large. It filled the room until even the faintest movement seemed loud. Morty looked at Rick and felt a small ache, the kind that comes when you realize someone powerful can still look fragile. The old man's head was tilted back, mouth slightly open, the lines on his face deeper than usual. In the faint light, he looked less like a genius and more like a ghost that refused to fade. Morty's gaze drifted again to the bottle. The light inside had changed. It wasn't swirling as before. It pulsed slow and steady, each flash timed like a heartbeat in the dark. Something about it drew him closer, as if the glow was breathing him in. He stood and stepped toward it, bare feet whispering against the metal floor. "Don't!" Rick's voice rasped behind him. Morty froze mid-step. "You were awake?" "I don't sleep long," Rick said without opening his eyes. "Not since I started keeping that thing close." Morty looked at the bottle again. "Why not?" Rick opened one eye, studying him. "Because it dreams when I do, and sometimes it dreams louder." The boy frowned, unsure what that meant. "You mean it's alive?" Rick finally sat up, his joints cracking faintly. "Alive's a lazy word, Morty. Everything hums if you listen hard enough. The thing just hums in a key that likes to follow me." Morty turned toward him. "You said it was peaceful last night." Rick smirked faintly. "Last night it was. Today it remembers." He stood stretching the stiffness out of his limbs and moved toward the console. The screens flickered to life with coded light, equations tumbling like rain. He began typing, muttering under his breath. Morty watched him, the tension in his movements sharper than before. "Rick," he said quietly, "what if it's trying to tell you something?" Rick didn't look up. "You think it's got feelings?" "I don't know," Morty said. "Maybe not feelings like us, but maybe something like memory." Rick paused. His reflection on the glass monitor flickered, distorted by data light. "You're starting to sound like me," he said finally, "and that's never good news." The ship trembled slightly. A soft tone echoed through the cabin, an alert. Rick's eyes narrowed. Now what? He leaned closer to the display. A signal blinked on the screen, faint but rhythmic, matching perfectly with the pulse of the bottled universe. "Morty," he said slowly, "get over here." Morty came to his side. On the monitor, the blinking expanded into waves, soft oscillations that pulsed outward like ripples in water. "Is that coming from the bottle?" Rick nodded once. "Looks like it. It's broadcasting something." "What kind of signal?" Rick's brow furrowed. "Binary. No. Wait. Patterned resonance. Like it's mirroring something." He began typing faster, hands moving in a blur. Lines of code spilled down the screen. The hum in the room deepened until Morty felt it in his ribs. "Rick, it's getting louder." I know," Rick muttered. "It's syncing with something external, but that's impossible. There's nothing out here for it to sync with." The lights dimmed, then flickered. The bottled glow brightened suddenly, casting long shadows across the cabin. Morty took a step back, shielding his eyes. "Rick!" "Stay back!" Rick shouted, but his voice was half drowned by the rising hum. The bottle's surface shimmered like liquid glass. Inside, the tiny galaxy spun faster, collapsing inward toward a single point of light. The air vibrated with a low, aching tone, a sound that felt less like hearing and more like remembering something forgotten. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The hum, the flicker, everything. Silence fell so abruptly it rang in Morty's ears. Rick exhaled, his face paled. "Okay," he muttered. "Okay, that was new." Morty blinked hard, trying to steady his breathing. "What just happened?" Rick walked to the shelf, slowly, cautiously. The bottle was dim again, its light soft and steady. He picked it up, turned it in his hand, and frowned. "It just opened a line." "A line?" "A connection," Rick said, "to something that shouldn't exist." Morty's stomach dropped. "Like another universe?" Rick nodded. "Or another me." He placed the bottle carefully on the console. The glow pulsed faintly again, once, twice, then steadied. Rick stared at it, the reflection of the light flickering across his face. "Morty," he said quietly, "you ever wonder if every version of me is out there building their own tiny worlds, trying to fix what they broke?" Morty hesitated. "I guess I never thought about it." Rick smiled sadly. "That's the difference between us. You still think some things can stay broken without needing to be rebuilt." He reached for the bottle again, but this time when his fingers touched the glass, the light inside shifted. The tiny stars moved apart, rearranging themselves until they formed a shape. Morty leaned closer. It wasn't random. The galaxies aligned into a faint outline, two figures standing side by side. "Rick," Morty whispered. "That's us." Rick didn't move. His jaw tightened. eyes locked on the image. For a moment he looked ancient, older than the stars outside. It's showing me what it remembers, he said softly, not what it sees. Morty's voice trembled. It remembers you? Rick nodded, almost imperceptibly. It remembers everything I gave it. Every part of me I thought I could hide in the light. The bottle pulsed again, faint but insistent. Then, in a voice that wasn't sound but vibration, a whisper bloomed in Morty's mind. You left us. He gasped, stumbling back. Rick, did you hear that? Rick's eyes widened. What did it say? It said you left them. Rick's hands trembled slightly. Yeah, he murmured. I guess I did. The glow faded once more, settling back into its soft rhythm. The silence after felt heavier than any noise. Rick sat down slowly, eyes fixed on the tiny universe. I used to think creation was control, he said. You build something, you define it. But it turns out creation's just another way of remembering what you lost. Morty swallowed hard. Who did you lose? Rick didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward the viewport, where the stars stretched endlessly, patient and indifferent. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. Someone who believed I could build forever. Someone who didn't understand that forever's the cruelest word in the multiverse. Morty looked at him, unsure whether to ask more. The air between them felt fragile, like thin glass holding too much weight. After a long silence, Rick said, she wanted to see a world I made. I told her someday, then I never showed her. Morty's chest tightened. You think this thing remembers her too? Rick nodded faintly. Every light in there probably has her reflection somewhere. They sat in stillness. The bottled universe flickered gently, like a candle trapped in crystal. Morty could almost feel the weight of its quiet watching. Finally, he said, what are you going to do with it now? Rick leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Let it speak. He reached for a control panel, typing in commands. The ship's hum deepened as scanners synced with the bottle's energy. Lines of data spilled across the screen, forming patterns that moved like heartbeat graphs. The shapes grew, expanding outward until they resembled waves, ripples stretching across infinite blank. Rick whispered, it's mapping the signal. Every pulse is a coordinate. Coordinates to where? Rick's lips pressed into a thin line. To whoever's still listening. Morty stared at him. You're gonna answer? Rick's eyes flickered with something between dread and curiosity. Wouldn't you? Outside, the stars seemed to lean closer. The bottle's glow brightened once more, soft but certain, like a door beginning to open. Rick placed a hand on the console, steadying himself. If this thing's reaching out, it means something survived. Maybe not her, maybe not me, but something. Morty nodded slowly, voice barely a whisper. Then let's find it. Rick looked at him, surprised by the steadiness in his tone. For a moment, pride flickered through the fatigue in his eyes. All right, kid, he said. Let's follow the ghost. He hit the command. The engines rumbled to life, light spilling through the cabin like dawn. The bottle pulsed once more, bright, alive, remembering. And as the ship turned toward the unknown, the stars outside seemed to rearrange themselves, as if making room for something long overdue to return home. The stars slipped by in silence, their light stretching into soft ribbons as the ship moved through the void. Somewhere between constellations and forgotten timelines, Rick sat hunched over the console, the bottled universe glowing faintly beside him. The signal pulsed steady now, guiding them through a path no chart had ever recorded. Morty watched from the co-pilot's seat, half in awe, half in unease. The hum of the engines felt different, less mechanical, more alive. Rick hadn't spoken much since they began following the signal. He adjusted settings, rewired frequencies, scribbled strange equations on a notepad, but his eyes betrayed something quiet and unguarded. Morty recognized it as the same look he saw once when Rick thought no one was watching, the look of someone remembering a voice that no longer answered back. Rick, Morty said softly, breaking the silence. Where do you think it's taking us? Rick didn't look up. It's not taking us anywhere. We're following it. Yeah, but why? You said it could be dangerous. What if it's some kind of trap? Rick gave a half-hearted shrug. Every discovery's a trap if you stay in it too long. Morty frowned, unsure what that meant. You mean like getting stuck in your own curiosity? Rick finally glanced at him, one eyebrow raised. You're getting better at this existential crap, Morty. The ship shuddered softly as they crossed a field of drifting matter, tiny luminous shards floating like dust motes. They passed through it slowly, each particle catching the light and scattering it across the walls like 1,000 fragile memories. Morty leaned close to the viewport, mesmerized. It's beautiful, he whispered. Rick didn't respond. He was watching too, though. His gaze wasn't on the beauty, but on the patterns within it. Those aren't particles, he murmured. They're fragments. Fragments of what? Rick hesitated. Of something that used to be whole. The words hung heavy in the air. Morty turned to look at him, but Rick had already gone back to his calculations, pretending indifference he no longer possessed. Hours or maybe days passed without measure. The universe outside had no rhythm, no sense of time, just endless drifting and soft rhythmic pulses from the bottle, each one a faint heartbeat that seemed to whisper closer. Morty began to feel it too, like a pull beneath his thoughts, guiding his dreams even when he closed his eyes. When he woke again, Rick was standing at the viewport, silhouetted against the glow of distant nebulae. A half-empty flask floated near his hand, caught in the low gravity. Couldn't sleep? Morty asked groggily. Rick didn't turn around. Didn't try. Morty rubbed his eyes. You still thinking about her? Rick chuckled under his breath. You think I ever stopped? The boy said nothing. The silence stretched, soft but heavy, like snow falling in an empty street. After a while, Rick spoke again. You know, when you build something out of memory, it always ends up being a mirror. You start out trying to create something new, but it just keeps reflecting what you lost. Until one day, you can't tell if you're inventing or remembering. Morty watched him carefully. You think that's what this bottle is? Rick nodded faintly. Every world I made started as a test. Physics, chemistry, entropy. But somewhere along the line, I started building them softer, kinder, like I was trying to make a place where something or someone could stay. Morty hesitated. And she didn't? Rick's shoulders tensed. Nobody stays forever, Morty. That's the first law of everything. He reached for the console, changing the scanner frequency. The display flickered, revealing faint structures ahead, ribbons of energy weaving together in slow motion, forming what looked like a cosmic whirlpool. The signal's pulse grew stronger. There, Rick said. That's where it's coming from. Morty leaned forward. The view was breathtaking. A vast spiral of blue and gold light spinning in silence like a celestial heartbeat. In the center, a faint shadow lingered, shifting as though alive. Is that another universe? Rick's voice dropped to a whisper. It's a memory field, a collection of quantum echoes, remnants of collapsed realities. Every universe that died left a scar somewhere, and this is where the scars drift. Morty felt a chill. So we're flying into, what, a graveyard? Rick gave a small, humorless smile. Something like that. The hum deepened as the ship approached the outer rim. The light outside flickered, bending strangely around them. For a moment, Morty saw faces in the glow. Fleeting, tender, sorrowful. Maybe tricks of his mind, or maybe something older than dreaming. As they entered the spiral, the bottle began to vibrate. Rick steadied it with one hand, his eyes sharp again. Easy, he murmured. We're not here to break anything. We're here to listen. Morty swallowed. To who? Rick didn't answer. The ship drifted deeper, swallowed by color and silence. Then faintly the comms crackled to life, a static whisper, fractured and thin. It wasn't language, but tone, a sound of longing, faint as breath. Morty's eyes widened. Rick, that sounds like... I know, Rick said softly. His voice trembled. Just once. It's her frequency. The bottle's glow flared, synchronizing perfectly with the sound. Inside, the tiny galaxy spun faster, forming the faint outline of a figure blurry, made of light, but human in shape. Morty felt tears prick his eyes. Rick, is that... Rick's voice cracked slightly. Don't say it, Morty. Not yet. The figure in the bottle raised a hand, slow and graceful, as though waving through time itself. The whisper grew clearer, a melody without words. Rick reached out instinctively, pressing his fingertips to the glass. The ship's lights dimmed, and for a moment it felt as if the entire universe was holding its breath. Then quietly the voice came, not through speakers, but directly into their minds. You kept it safe. Rick froze. His throat worked, but no words came. Morty turned toward him, heart pounding. Rick, who is she? Rick's eyes stayed on the light. Someone who believed I could make something beautiful out of the mess I am. His voice was barely more than a whisper. And I think she was right. Once. The voice came again, softer this time. You built it from our laughter. You built it from our nights under the same stars. Morty felt the words like waves, slow and warm. Rick's hand trembled against the bottle. You remember that? He whispered. I remember everything you couldn't say. The light inside the bottle dimmed slightly, flickering like a candle. Rick swallowed hard. I tried to save it all, he said, voice breaking. I thought if I bottled the universe, I could bottle you too. You never had to. The voice replied. You already did. Morty turned away, tears blurring his vision. He never heard Rick sound so human, so small and infinite at once. Then the glow began to fade, the pulse slowing. Rick pressed closer, desperate. No, don't go yet. You have to let go, the voice said gently. The stars don't need to be remembered to shine. The light flickered once more, brighter than before, and then nothing. The bottle went dark. The silence afterward was unbearable. Rick stayed still, his hand on the glass, the reflection of extinguished light across his eyes. Morty whispered, "Rick, she's gone." Rick shook his head faintly. "No, she's everywhere now." Outside the viewport, the spiral of light shifted one last time, then began to scatter, dissolving into the void. The ship drifted through the remnants, the debris of memories that once glowed like suns. Morty finally spoke, his voice trembling. "What was her name?" Rick's eyes softened. "Doesn't matter what name I gave her. What matters is she remembered mine." He leaned back, closing his eyes. The hum of the ship quieted. The bottle on the console stayed dark, but faintly, almost imperceptibly, a single speck of light flickered deep within. Morty watched it, heart aching but strangely calm. "Rick? Yeah? Do you think she's still out there somewhere?" Rick smiled without opening his eyes. "Nah, Morty. She's right here." The boy looked at him, then back at the bottle. The soft pulse continued, slow, peaceful, steady. Outside, the stars folded around them like a blanket, and for a long while neither of them spoke. The ship drifted quietly through the endless dark, following no map, no destination, just a rhythm, two heartbeats and one tiny enduring light that refused to fade. For a long time after the voice faded, Rick didn't speak. The ship drifted wordlessly through the ruins of the light spiral, its hum barely louder than breath. Morty sat across from him, watching the stars slide past like old photographs, their edges blurred by time. The bottle lay between them on the console, dim again, but still pulsing faintly like a memory refusing to die. Morty wanted to ask something, anything, but the quiet felt sacred and he didn't want to break it. Rick had leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, but he wasn't asleep. His breathing was too deliberate, his fingers tapping absently against the armrest in a rhythm. Morty didn't recognize. It wasn't impatience, it was something closer to remembering a song that used to mean everything. Eventually, Morty whispered, "Rick, are we going back?" Rick opened one eye, staring at the dark bottle. "Back where, Morty?" "I don't know. Home, maybe." Rick's mouth twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Home's not a place, kid." It's the few seconds before you realize you've lost it. Morty looked down. The ship's lights reflected softly on the glass surface of the console. He wanted to argue, to remind Rick that there were still people waiting for them somewhere. But he couldn't, because somewhere deep down, he knew Rick wasn't wrong. The ship beeped softly. A proximity alert gentle, not urgent. Rick leaned forward, brow furrowing. That's new. Morty straightened. "What is it?" Rick adjusted a dial, and a holographic display bloomed above the console, a faint cluster of energy ahead, small but dense. "It's like a remnant," he muttered. "Residual energy from a pocket universe collapse. But it's moving. Moving? Like alive?" Rick didn't answer. He reached out, adjusting another control. "Set course. Slow approach." The engines whispered to life, gliding them toward the faint anomaly. Through the viewport, a shimmer appeared in the distance, like a tear in space, glowing faintly blue. It pulsed once, twice, then held steady. As they drew closer, Morty noticed patterns flickering within it, shapes, shadows, almost like silhouettes moving through fog. "Rick," he said quietly, "do you see that?" Rick's expression hardened. "Yeah, I see it." The bottle on the console began to glow again, faint at first, then brighter. Its pulse synced perfectly with the shimmer ahead. Rick cursed softly. "Of course it's connected." Morty leaned closer, squinting. "Connected how?" Rick's voice dropped to a whisper. "It's an echo field, like a mirror trying to remember what it used to reflect. Whatever's in there is responding to the signal we followed." He hesitated, then reached out to the bottle. The moment his fingers touched the glass, the glow flared. The shimmer ahead expanded outward, forming a ring of light so bright it painted the cockpit in silver. Morty gasped. "Rick, what's happening?" Rick's jaw tightened. "It's opening something. A door, maybe. Or a memory." The ship trembled as the ring drew them in. There was no sense of motion, just the feeling of falling without moving, of being stretched and folded all at once. Then everything went white. When the light faded, the hum of the engines was gone. The ship floated silently in what looked like a sky, but it wasn't any sky Morty recognized. The stars were closer here, almost within reach, and the air shimmered as if it carried the breath of old dreams. Rick blinked, disoriented, then looked out the viewport. Below them stretched an endless sea of glass, smooth, reflective, rippling gently with no wind. It looked like the whole universe had paused to admire its own reflection. Morty whispered, "Where are we?" Rick stared down, voice hushed, inside the memory field. The bottle floated from the console, drifting weightlessly toward the glass sea outside. It hung suspended for a moment, then descended slowly, landing on the surface without sinking. Rick unstrapped himself, moving toward the airlock. "Wait, Rick," Morty called. "You're not seriously—" "I am," Rick interrupted. "Whatever this is, it's not random. It called to us. I'm answering." Morty hurried after him. The hatch opened with a soft sigh and warm, still air flowed in, scented faintly with something that reminded Morty of rain and electricity. They stepped out onto the sea, the glass beneath their feet solid but soft, like standing on memory itself. Every step sent ripples of light spreading outward. The stars reflected in the surface moved too, as if alive. Rick walked ahead, gaze fixed on the bottle resting a few meters away. When they reached it, the glow brightened again. Then, as if reacting to Rick's presence, the surface beneath them shifted. Shapes began to form beneath the glass. Images, faint and moving. Morty gasped. "Rick, that's you!" Beneath their feet, the scene unfolded like a dream. Rick, years younger, stood in a lab, laughing softly with a woman whose face shimmered like starlight. They were building something together, a tiny swirling core of light floating between their hands. The same bottle. Rick knelt down, staring at the image. His hand hovered above the surface, but didn't touch. "She said it could hold a piece of forever," he murmured. "I told her forever wasn't worth keeping." Morty watched silently as the image changed. The woman was gone now, the lab empty, the bottle glowing brighter. Rick stood alone, pouring more and more light into it, face hollow with exhaustion. Then, the scene darkened. The glass cracked. The bottle trembled. The younger Rick screamed, soundless, but full of loss. And then it ended. The sea stilled. The reflections faded. Morty stepped closer. "She helped you build it?" Rick nodded faintly. "She built the soul, I built the cage." They stood there for a long time, surrounded by silence. The bottle glowed faintly between them, softer now, almost tender. Morty's voice was small. "Rick, do you think she forgave you?" Rick's answer came after a long pause. "I don't think forgiveness works across dimensions, Morty. But maybe she remembered me kindly. That's close enough." The sea rippled again, the stars above dimmed, and from the horizon a faint figure began to appear, walking across the surface, steps leaving trails of light. Morty's breath caught. "Rick, it's her." The figure moved closer, her form made of shifting stars and soft light. She didn't speak, but the air around her seemed to hum with quiet music. Rick stood frozen, eyes wide, every defense he ever built dissolving in a heartbeat. When she stopped a few feet away, the glow from the bottle matched her rhythm exactly. Rick took a slow breath. "I thought you were gone." The figure tilted her head slightly, smiling, a gesture that felt like sunlight breaking through grief. Rick's voice broke. "I'm sorry." No words came from her, but the music in the air deepened, gentle and forgiving. She raised a hand, touching his face without touching it, her fingers made of light, dissolving as they brushed his cheek. Morty watched silent as Rick closed his eyes. A tear slipped down, catching the reflection of the stars. Then the figure turned slowly and began to walk away, toward the horizon where the glass met the sky. With each step, her form faded, until she was just a shimmer of light swallowed by distance. Rick stood unmoving, staring after her. The glow of the bottle dimmed once more, finally still. Morty stepped closer, voice barely a whisper. "Rick, was that goodbye?" Rick didn't look at him. "No," he said softly. "That was remembering." The surface beneath them began to tremble. Cracks of light spread outward. The air shimmered and the stars above flickered violently. "She's closing it," Rick said quietly. "The field's collapsing." Morty grabbed his arm. "Then let's go." Rick hesitated one heartbeat longer, eyes lingering on where the light had disappeared. Then he nodded. They ran back toward the ship, their reflections scattering like broken constellations beneath their feet. As the hatch sealed behind them, the glass sea shattered completely. The ship jolted violently as it was thrown free, tumbling through collapsing light. Morty shouted something, but his voice vanished in the noise. Then silence again. The ship drifted once more in open space. The bottle lay dark on the console, but this time no pulse followed. Rick exhaled slowly, shoulders slumping. Morty whispered, "She's really gone now, isn't she?" Rick stared out the viewport at the endless dark. "No, Morty," he said finally, voice steady but soft. "She just finally found somewhere else to be remembered." Outside, a single star flickered in the distance, gentle, golden, unending. It pulsed once, twice, like a heartbeat, and Rick, for the first time in a long while, let himself just watch. The ship floated in silence, surrounded by a darkness so vast it seemed to listen. The faint hum of the stabilizers was the only sign of motion, a ghostly whisper that filled the cabin like the last breath of a dream. Rick sat in the pilot's chair, staring blankly at the viewport where the single golden star still pulsed steady, patient, unending. Morty had fallen asleep hours ago, curled up in the co-pilot's seat, his head tilted toward the glass, mouth slightly open. The reflection of the star shimmered across his face, flickering with each slow rise and fall of his breath. Rick glanced at him once, then looked away. Something in the boy's calm unsettled him. He'd spent a lifetime outrunning quiet moments like this, because quiet was where memory lived. He reached for the bottle again, half expecting it to glow, to hum, to offer some sign that the impossible had meant something, but it didn't. It was only glass now, cold, empty, ordinary. The kind of thing you could mistake for nothing if you didn't know how much of everything it once held. Rick poured himself a drink instead, the amber liquid catching the light from the star. He took a slow sip, the burn grounding him in the now. For once, it didn't taste like escape. It tasted like stillness. He set the glass down, leaned back, and muttered under his breath, "You got what you wanted, didn't you?" The silence didn't answer, but somehow he knew she'd heard him. Somewhere beyond light and logic, beyond even his own arrogance, she was there, folded into the quiet pulse of that star. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, the instruments flickered. A low beep echoed through the cabin, pulling him back to focus. Morty stirred. "Rick, what's happening?" Rick leaned forward. "We're not alone." The sensor display showed a faint signature moving toward them, a ship, small, deliberate, its trajectory unwavering. No transponder signal, no ID beacon, just motion. Morty rubbed his eyes. Another ship? Out here? Rick didn't respond. He zoomed the scanner feed, watching as the shape grew clearer. It wasn't like any ship Morty had ever seen. The hull was smooth, curved like a teardrop, its surface reflecting the surrounding stars perfectly, so much so that it seemed half invisible. "It's cloaked with photonic skin," Rick muttered. "That tech doesn't exist. Not yet, anyway." And Morty frowned. "Then how?" Before he could finish, a voice came through the comm, soft, calm, unmistakably human. "Dr. Sanchez." Rick froze. The voice was unfamiliar, but it carried a strange echo, as if layered with memory. "Who's this?" he said. "You opened a door you weren't meant to find," the voice replied. "Now something else has found you." Morty straightened, heart pounding. "Rick, what does that mean?" Rick didn't answer. He switched on manual control and angled the ship away, but the teardrop-shaped vessel matched their movement perfectly. "All right," Rick muttered. "You want to play? We'll play." He jerked a lever, sending the ship into a sharp dive. Stars streaked into lines of light, space warping around them. Morty gripped the console. "Rick?" Rick didn't slow down. "If they can follow this, we're in trouble." But the other ship did follow smoothly, effortlessly, like it already knew every move before Rick made it. Then just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The ship froze mid-flight, systems flickering. Rick slammed the controls, but they didn't respond. "What the hell?" The voice returned, softer now. He brought back what wasn't meant to return. The golden star outside flared suddenly, blindingly bright. Morty shielded his eyes. "Rick, the star." The light poured through the cockpit like liquid, filling the ship. The bottle on the console began to vibrate, glowing faintly again. Or swore under his breath, "Not again." The light intensified until everything vanished. When Rick opened his eyes, the ship was gone. He was standing on solid ground, a pale field of dust under a violet sky. The air was cool, still, perfectly silent. Morty stood beside him, blinking in confusion. "Where are we now?" Morty whispered. Rick looked around. The landscape stretched endlessly, dotted with faint shapes. Structures that looked like statues, though each one was blurred as if carved from fog. In the distance, something shimmered. A tall, translucent figure walking toward them. Rick tensed. "Stay behind me." The figure drew closer, and as it did, it began to shift, taking on form, color, detail. A woman. The same woman from before. But this time, she wasn't made of light. She was solid. Real. Morty's voice broke. "Rick, it's her." Rick didn't move. His heart beat once, hard against his ribs. "That's not possible." She stopped a few feet away, her expression calm, eyes deep with a kind of peace Rick hadn't seen in anyone for years. "You shouldn't have followed," she said softly. Rick's throat felt dry. "You shouldn't have left." She smiled faintly. "You always said that time was just another mistake waiting to happen." Morty looked between them, completely lost. "Wait, what's going on? I thought she was..." Gone? Rick finished for him, eyes never leaving hers. Yeah, I did too. She took a step closer. The air rippled around her and Rick felt his own thoughts blur for a moment, as if the universe forgot what shape it was supposed to take. This isn't a place, Rick, she said. It's a consequence. Every world you built to escape me, all the universes you folded and remade, they left echoes. And when you reached for the bottle again, those echoes reached back. Rick swallowed hard. So what is this then? Purgatory for geniuses who can't let go. She smiled again, sadder this time. Closure, if you'll take it. Morty shifted uneasily. Rick, do we have to stay here? Rick glanced at him, then back at her. You're offering me what exactly? Peace? Forgiveness? No, she said, understanding. The wind moved through the violet dust, whispering in tones that almost sounded like voices. Around them, the fog-carved statues began to move, turning slowly, each one revealing faces Rick recognized. Countless versions of himself. Some older, some broken, some still laughing. Morty gasped. They're all you. Rick watched silently. One of the reflections stepped forward, face half hidden in shadow. You never learned, did you? It said in his own voice. You can't fix the things you kill by remembering them. Another voice, his again from a different angle. You think regret makes you real? It just makes you late. The air pulsed with overlapping echoes, dozens of Rick speaking at once, their words blending into a chorus of accusation and truth. Morty covered his ears. Rick, make it stop! Rick's eyes flared with defiance. I already did. He reached out and grabbed the bottle from the ground. It had appeared beside him again, glowing faintly. Without hesitation, he smashed it against the violet dust. The sound was sharp, final, like glass shattering across time itself. The light exploded outward, erasing everything. The echoes, the sky, even the ground beneath their feet. And then there was only stillness. When the world reformed, they were back in the ship. The console flickered weakly. Morty gasped for air, disoriented. Rick, what did you do? Rick stared at the empty space where the bottle had been. Nothing remained, not even a fragment. I ended it, he said quietly. All of it. Morty swallowed hard. Was she real? Rick didn't answer right away. He looked out the viewport again. The golden star was gone. In its place was only the ordinary scatter of distant constellations. Finally, he said, she was real enough to haunt me. That's what matters. Morty leaned back, exhausted. So what now? Rick's eyes softened, not with defeat, but with something else. Acceptance. Now, Morty, we live! He powered up the ship. The helm returned, low and steady. The stars ahead stretched into lines as the warp drive engaged. As they jumped into the next horizon, the space behind them folded quietly shut, leaving no trace of what had been lost or found. Only the faintest glimmer, like a heartbeat fading into forever. In somewhere in the silent depths between stars, a voice whispered, not to be heard but to be felt. You finally let go. The stars ahead stretched and blurred like wet paint across the canvas of infinity. The ship glided silently through the drift, its lights dimmed to the hue of candle flame. Morty slept again, slumped in his seat, one hand still loosely clutching the corner of his blanket. Rick watched him for a long moment, not the way a scientist observes a subject, but the way a weary traveler stares at something fragile that he doesn't know how to protect. The hum of the engines was softer tonight, almost like a heartbeat. Rick adjusted the navigation not because he needed to, but because silence pressed too close when he didn't. Every few seconds he caught his reflection in the glass, faint, spectral, the face of someone who had seen too many universes to belong to any of them. He poured another drink, though he wasn't sure why anymore. The bottle didn't sing, didn't glow, didn't carry memory. It was just what it was, a hollow comfort in a quiet ship. Somewhere deep in the circuitry, the ship murmured, a soft, uncertain tone like a sigh. Rick frowned. You getting sentimental on me too, huh? He said to no one, but the words felt like they reached someone all the same. Outside, the stars thickened. They were approaching a belt of debris, fragments of something old drifting without pattern or gravity. It wasn't dangerous. Not really. Just haunting. The ship's sensors pinged faint traces of metal, old radiation, and faint life signatures that were probably just static echoes. But one signal lingered, a pattern too steady to be random. Rick zoomed in, expecting another derelict ship or one of the countless failed colonies left behind in the quieter corners of the multiverse. What appeared instead made his chest tighten. A dome. Small, glassy, anchored to an asteroid like a snow globe adrift in eternity. Inside it, faint lights flickered. Artificial sky. Simulated clouds. He zoomed further. Morty stirred beside him, muttering in half-dreams. Rick's hand hesitated over the controls. His jaw tightened. He almost turned away. Almost. But curiosity, that old curse, whispered again. He steered toward it. The dome grew larger in the viewport until it filled the frame completely. Through the curve of its glass, they could see a faint landscape. A tiny world no bigger than a city block. A meadow. A river, no wider than a street. And a single house built of pale stone. The kind of house that shouldn't exist anywhere near the stars. Rick cut the engines to a soft glide. The silence deepened. Morty yawned awake. Rick, where are we now? Rick's voice was low. Nowhere that should still be standing. Morty leaned forward, squinting. Is that a house? Out here? Rick didn't answer. His hand trembled slightly as he initiated the docking sequence. Wait, Rick, Morty said, his voice rising. We're not just landing there, right? What if it's haunted, booby-trapped, a cosmic simulation of my worst mistakes? Yeah, probably. Rick's mouth twitched into something almost like a smile. But that's the fun part, kid. The ship settled with a hiss against the asteroid's surface. The airlock opened with a sigh, releasing a faint scent into the cabin, not ozone or burnt metal, but something softer. Grass, rain, earth. Morty blinked. I can smell trees. Rick stepped out first. His boots touched ground that felt wrong in the right way. Too soft, too alive. Above them, the sky shimmered faintly, an imitation painted across the inside of the dome. Sunlight filtered through it, gentle and gold. The meadow stretched before them, full of long grass and faint whispers. Wind that wasn't real moved through air that almost was. Morty followed close, whispering, "This feels like a dream." Rick didn't reply. His eyes were fixed on the house ahead. It was old, worn, the kind of place built by hands that cared more about shelter than beauty. A swing hung from a low branch near the porch, still swaying slightly, though there was no wind strong enough to move it. They stopped at the door. Rick hesitated, fingers hovering just above the handle. Morty looked up at him. Do you know this place? Rick's voice came quiet, distant. Yeah. The door creaked open before he could touch it. Inside, the air was warm. Dust hung in the light like snow. Furniture stood where it always had. Old wood, faintly glowing panels, the hum of tech hidden beneath the floorboards. Morty stepped in behind him, wide-eyed. It's like somebody still lives here. Rick's gaze moved across the room. A workbench cluttered with parts. A half-finished project. A mug, his mug still sitting on the counter, half full, the stain around the rim perfectly preserved. He walked slowly to the table and touched it. It felt real. Too real. A voice came from behind him. You never finished the design. Rick turned. She stood in the doorway, the woman again, or something that looked like her, but now her form was stable, her outline sharp. No glow, no blur, just her. Morty stepped back instinctively. Rick? Rick lifted a hand. It's all right. His voice was almost steady. I know what this is. She smiled faintly. Do you? He nodded, a memory I didn't erase. She crossed the room slowly, her footsteps soundless on the floor. You never erase anything, Rick. You just bury it under the next invention, the next distraction, the next universe. Rick's jaw tightened. And yet here you are, still haunting me. Not haunting, she said gently. Reminding. Morty's voice was small. Reminding him of what? She turned to him, her expression soft. That even the smartest minds forget how to be still. Rick looked away, studying the walls, the light, the illusion. This place isn't real. It's real enough to remember you, she said. Outside, the false sun dipped lower, turning the meadow to amber. Morty walked toward the window, staring out at the sky. It's beautiful, he whispered, like it's pretending not to fade. Rick closed his eyes for a moment. He wanted to be angry, to tear apart the illusion, to strip it down to the data underneath. But something in him refused. Maybe exhaustion, maybe peace. Why show me this? He asked finally. She tilted her head, the same way she used to when he said something too clever for his own good. Because you've spent your life building ways to escape endings. You needed to see one that doesn't hurt. Rick looked at her, then really looked. The way someone stares at the horizon knowing it's the last thing they'll see before nightfall. Her form flickered slightly, a ripple through the air. You're leaving again, he said. She nodded once, only because you finally can. Morty turned. Rick. But Rick was already moving. He stepped closer to her, close enough that the light between them felt warm again. If I let this go, he whispered, what happens to the part of me that stayed here? She smiled. He rests. The air shimmered. The house began to fade, its edges dissolving into gold dust. The walls went translucent, the furniture thinning into memory. Morty gasped, clutching the edge of the doorframe as the entire illusion unraveled. Rick didn't move. The woman's hand hovered just before his, fingers not quite touching. "Goodbye, Rick," she said softly. He exhaled. "Yeah, goodbye." Then she was gone. The light folded in on itself, and the meadow vanished. When Rick opened his eyes, he was back in the ship. Morty sat beside him, eyes wide, breath shaky. "Rick, was that real?" Rick's hand rested on the console, steady this time. "It doesn't matter," he said. It was enough. Outside, the dome crumbled into stardust, scattering across the void. Morty watched as the last fragments drifted into the darkness. "Where do we go now?" Rick looked out into the endless stretch of stars. "Forward, kid. Always forward." The ship began to move again. Slow, sure, almost peaceful. For the first time in a long while, Rick didn't look back. And somewhere, beneath the hum of the engines, a quiet echo whispered through the hull, not words, just a faint pulse of something gentle, something human. A memory resting at last. The stars had begun to thin, as though the universe itself were growing tired. For days, if days even meant anything out here, Rick and Morty drifted through the quietest corners of the void. The hum of the ship had become their heartbeats, steady, subdued, a low vibration that kept the silence from collapsing in on them. Morty spent most of his time near the viewport, his chin resting on his arms as he stared into the endless sprawl. He didn't speak much now. Words seemed too loud for whatever space they were passing through. Sometimes, when Rick thought the kid was asleep, he caught him whispering to himself, half prayers, half thoughts, trying to make sense of everything that didn't want to be understood. Rick didn't ask. He just listened to the silence, feeling the weight of a universe that suddenly seemed smaller. On the fourth drift cycle, something changed. The sensors picked up a pulse, one clean, rhythmic vibration echoing across the ether. Not a distress signal, not random noise. Something deliberate. Morty looked up from the viewport. "Is that someone calling us?" Rick frowned. "Or something trying to remember we exist." He adjusted the frequency, letting the sound fill the cabin. It was faint but melodic, like a lullaby played through static. Morty tilted his head. "It sounds familiar." Rick didn't respond. He was too busy trying not to recognize it. He leaned over the console, fine-tuning the signal. As he did, the rhythm began to match the hum of their own engines. Syncing perfectly, heartbeat to heartbeat, the entire ship vibrated in harmony. Morty's voice dropped to a whisper. "Rick, what is that?" Rick's eyes flicked toward the data feed. "It's coming from the drift verge." Morty frowned. "What's that?" Rick hesitated. "It's a gap between universes, a kind of resting place for worlds that never finished existing. Fragments, half-born timelines. You can't reach it unless you stop wanting to." Morty stared at him. "That doesn't even make sense." Rick's mouth twitched, somewhere between a smirk and a sigh. "Yeah, that's why it works." The pulse continued, soft but insistent, like it wanted them closer. Rick hesitated only a moment before turning the ship toward it. The journey there wasn't dramatic. There was no warp flash, no violent shift, just a gradual unraveling. The stars began to lose their sharpness, blurring at the edges. The ship's instruments dimmed without failing, as though reality were exhaling and taking them along for the ride. When they crossed into the verge, the light outside changed. It wasn't darkness, it was memory. Clouds of color hung in the void, fragments of skies from forgotten worlds. Mountains suspended mid-collapse. Oceans folding inward like silk. Every fragment glowed faintly like a photograph developing in water. Morty pressed his face to the glass. "Whoa! Are those dead timelines?" Rick said quietly. "Universes that almost were, places where choices didn't make it to the end." They drifted between the fragments, each one flickering with faint echoes. Morty saw pieces of city streets that led nowhere, buildings with doors that opened into nothing. And then he saw one that stopped his breath. "Rick," he pointed, "that one looks like your garage." Rick didn't look. "Yeah, there are a lot of versions of that place." "No, Rick. I mean, it's exactly your garage. The one we just left." Rick turned then, his face unreadable. The fragment floated just beyond reach. His lab intact, suspended in light. The portal gun on the workbench. The empty bottle beside it. Morty swallowed. "Is that us? From another time?" Rick stared for a long moment, then shook his head. "No, it's a memory of us. The universe holds on to things, even when it shouldn't." He guided the ship closer, slowly, until the fragment filled the viewport. For a second, he could almost hear the hum of the old machines, smell the faint tang of burnt circuitry. Morty's voice was soft. Why does it still exist? Rick's answer was almost a whisper. 'Cause I didn't let it go. The ship floated there for a while, both of them silent. The fragment pulsed faintly, like a dying ember refusing to fade. Then without warning, the ship's lights flickered. The console beeped, soft but urgent. Morty straightened. What's happening? Rick's fingers flew across the controls. Something's pulling on the core. Gravitational feedback. From what? Before Rick could answer, the pulse from the verge deepened. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a presence rising through the floor, through the air, through their bones. And then the ship stopped moving. The viewport filled with light, pure and endless. The hum of the engines ceased. The air felt thick, like they were underwater. Morty grabbed the armrest. Rick, what is this? Rick squinted into the glow. A threshold. The edge between remembering and forgetting. The light dimmed just enough to reveal something within it, a silhouette faint but familiar. Morty froze. No way. Rick's voice went flat. Don't say it. But it was too late. The figure stepped closer. It was Rick or a version of him. Older, quieter, his eyes softer. He looked like someone who had finally stopped fighting himself. He looked at them both and smiled. You made it further than I did. Morty's voice cracked. What the hell is this? The older Rick turned his gaze toward him. The end of the road, kid. Or maybe the middle. Hard to tell from here. The real Rick's jaw clenched. I don't do sentimental hallucinations. So if you're another construct, get to the part where you disappear. The older version chuckled. Still the same deflection. Always talking until the truth shuts up. Morty glanced between them, his eyes wide. Rick, he looks like you, but he's not me, Rick snapped. Then after a pause, quieter, not anymore. The older Rick walked closer until only the glow separated them. You spent your life building exits. Every time you lost something, you built another door out of it. But this one, he gestured toward the verge, the fragments, the flickering worlds. This one isn't for running, it's for resting. Rick didn't move. His voice was barely audible. You think I came here to rest? No, the older one said gently. But maybe he did. He nodded toward Morty. Rick looked at the boy beside him, tired, quiet, his eyes still full of wonder despite everything. And for a moment, the silence between them spoke louder than any of his inventions ever could. The older Rick smiled faintly. You don't have to fix what was never broken. The light around him began to fade, his form dissolving back into the glow. Morty reached out instinctively. Wait, what's going to happen to him? Rick answered before the other could. He's going where all the other versions go, somewhere better than here. The glow pulsed one final time, and the older Rick was gone. The verge fell silent again. The pulse gone, the fragments dimming into stillness. Morty exhaled shakily. Rick, was that really you? Like another you? Rick stared into the empty light for a long while before replying. It was who I could have been if I'd stopped trying to outrun myself. Morty didn't speak. He just leaned back, his gaze fixed on the fading fragments. Rick turned the ship slowly, guiding it away from the verge. The hum of the engines returned, steady and familiar. As they left, the universe behind them seemed to fold closed, sealing like a healed wound. Morty broke the silence first. Do you ever think we'll find a place that feels like home? Rick's answer came after a long pause. Home isn't a place, Morty. It's the version of you that can sleep without running calculations. Morty smiled faintly. Guess we're still looking, huh? Rick didn't smile back, but there was warmth in his voice when he said, Yeah, kid, still looking. They drifted onward. The stars returned, sharper now, clearer. Somewhere in the distance, a faint hum echoed through the void, less like a machine this time, more like a lullaby. Neither of them spoke again. The ship sailed through the quiet, and in that calm, something unspoken finally settled. Not resolution, not peace, but something close enough to rest. And as they passed beyond the last edge of the verge, the stars seemed to blink slower, as though the universe itself were whispering, You can stop now. The ship glided through the black like a memory refusing to fade. Stars stretched and folded in silence, their light tracing faint lines across the hull. For a long while, there was nothing but the hum of the reactor and the soft clicking of Rick's instruments as he recalibrated the nav drive. Morty sat beside him, chin propped in his hand, eyes heavy but awake. Neither had spoken since leaving the verge. Rick's reflection shimmered faintly on the glass, his eyes red-rimmed, face worn but distant. He looked less like a genius now and more like someone who'd seen too much of himself. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was sacred. Fragile, like the air between two people standing over the ruins of something they once believed indestructible. Then the console flickered. A faint tone, almost hesitant, bled through the static. Morty blinked. Rick, is that another signal? Rick frowned, tapping the panel. No, that's a residual frequency, echo from the verge. It shouldn't exist outside that dimension. Morty leaned closer. So, what's it mean? Rick hesitated. It means something followed us. The sound deepened. One note held too long, vibrating through the cabin. The lights dimmed, shadows stretching across the metal. Outside, the stars seemed to blink slower, like the universe itself was holding its breath. Then came the voice. It wasn't words at first. More like an impression. A tone that spoke directly into thought. Rick's jaw clenched as he tried to filter it through his neural interface, but every attempt failed. Morty shivered. Rick, I think it's... Don't say it, Rick snapped. His hands moved quickly across the console. It's not him. The Verge doesn't send souvenirs. But what if it's... It's not... Rick's voice cracked, too sharp, too quick. Then quieter. It can't be. The sound faded. Silence again. Then faintly music. A piano. Slow, uncertain notes drifting through the cabin like memories finding their way home. Morty whispered, Rick, that's the song you used to play on Bird Person's old transmitter. Remember? When you said music was just organized regret? Rick didn't look at him. His eyes were locked on the viewport, on the faint shimmer of something forming ahead, a shape at the edge of perception, not quite real but not gone either. He rose slowly from his chair. Strap in, Morty. Morty obeyed without question. The ship eased forward, cutting through the dark until the shape resolved a derelict station, half buried in starlight, spinning slow and broken, panels torn, cables floating like veins in zero gravity. Morty squinted. What is that place? Rick's voice dropped. Citadel remains. A fragment that drifted too far. He guided the ship closer. Rusted hulls passed beneath them, remnants of thousands of Ricks and Mortys who'd once believed in structure. It looked like a graveyard built from their own mistakes. They docked at one of the surviving ports. The corridor beyond was silent, frozen. Rick adjusted his portal blaster, holstered it, then motioned for Morty to follow. As the door slid open, stale air rushed in, carrying the faint scent of metal and ozone. Their footsteps echoed in the hollow passageways. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. Screens flickered to life as they passed, showing fragments of old data faces, equations, memories looped on repeat. Morty stared at one of the screens. Rick? That's us! Rick turned. The feed showed an image of him and Morty standing in the garage laughing over some experiment long forgotten. Then static swallowed it. It's a data ghost, Rick muttered. Echoes left in the mainframe. Don't look too long, they bite. Morty swallowed hard. Bite? Not literally. Well, mostly not. They moved on. Down one corridor. The walls shimmered like they were breathing. The hum of the ship outside had vanished. Now only the pulse of the station remained slow, deliberate, almost like it had a heartbeat of its own. At the end of the hall, they found a door sealed with old tech, marked with a faint symbol. Rick stared at it for a long moment, his face hardened. It's a council chamber. Morty frowned. But they're all gone, right? Rick didn't answer. He pressed his palm to the scanner. The door opened with a sound like a sigh. Inside was a vast circular room filled with empty chairs, each one marked with the insignia of a different Rick. Some had decayed entirely, others remained pristine, untouched by time. In the center stood a console pulsing faintly with blue light. Morty whispered, "This place feels wrong." Rick approached the console, fingers trembling slightly as he brushed dust from its surface. The screen flared to life. Lines of data scrolled upward, coordinates, temporal signatures, names. Then one line stopped the scroll. Project Return? Initiated by R4. Rick froze. Morty's voice cracked. Rick, isn't that you? He didn't respond. The screen shifted, showing schematics, temporal resonance generators, neural anchors. Something labeled Consciousness Migration Stage 3. Morty stepped closer. What is this? Rick's voice was barely a whisper. That's me, or what I tried to build after losing everything. He scrolled further. Video fragments appeared. Rick, this same Rick, talking to himself in the lab, his voice hoarse. You can't keep doing this. Every Morty dies. Every bird person fades. Every version ends the same. So don't rebuild. Remember. Then the video cut. Morty stared at him. Rick, did you try to bring yourself back? Rick exhaled slowly. I tried to preserve understanding. Thought if I could save a pattern, maybe I wouldn't keep making the same mistakes. But it followed us, didn't it? That voice, that version of you. Rick turned away, eyes distant. Maybe it didn't follow. Maybe it was always here. The console pulsed again. The blue light spread across the room. crawling up the walls, filling the chamber with a soft hum. Then the speakers crackled and his own voice filled the air. You came back. Rick clenched his jaw. You're just a fragment. You don't exist outside this code. The voice chuckled, his chuckle. You said the same thing to every version of yourself that tried to feel. Morty looked around, panicked. Rick, make it stop. Rick typed rapidly, but the system didn't respond. The light brightened, flooding the chamber until everything glowed white-blue. Then silence. When the light faded, the chairs were full. Hundreds of Ricks sat in silence, each one slightly different, older, younger, scarred, mechanical, tired, their gazes fixed on the Rick standing in the center. Morty stumbled back. Rick, what the hell? Rick raised his portal gun, hand shaking. You're not real. One of the seated Ricks spoke. Neither are you. Rick fired. The blast tore through the image. It dissolved, reforming instantly. Every exit you built, another Rick said, was just another door back here. Rick's breathing quickened. I killed the council. I ended this. A third Rick smiled sadly. You ended a version. You never stopped the cycle. Morty's voice trembled. Rick, we gotta go. Rick lowered his gun, eyes flicking between them. No, Morty, this is it. The verge wasn't the end. This is the recursion point. The room brightened again, the voices overlapping, merging into one chorus, each Rick speaking the same lines slightly out of sync. Every universe leads home. Then everything collapsed. The chamber shattered into light, and for an instant, Morty felt weightless falling, spinning through countless reflections of himself and Rick, infinite versions flickering past like pages torn from a book. And then quiet. He opened his eyes. They were back on the ship. The stars steady again. Rick sat motionless in the pilot's chair, eyes open but distant. Morty whispered, Rick, are you okay? Rick blinked once. To fine, okay. What happened? Rick exhaled. We looped, saw the center of the maze. Turns out it's just us again. Morty swallowed hard. So what now? Rick's gaze drifted to the stars. Now we keep moving. That's all there ever is. Morty nodded slowly. Until what? Rick almost smiled. Until the silence feels like company. The ship turned, engines whispering back to life. The stars stretched once more, endless and patient. As they drifted into the void, Morty closed his eyes, and somewhere beyond the hum of machinery, he swore he could still hear that faint piano, the sound of one version of Rick finally forgiving another. The ship vanished into the dark, leaving behind only a faint trail of light that shimmered for a heartbeat before dissolving into the quiet eternity. The stars were quiet that night, or maybe they were always quiet and Rick was only now learning how to listen. The ship moved like a drifting thought, its lights dimmed, its engines breathing in slow, tired intervals. Morty had fallen asleep in the co-pilot's chair, his head tilted to one side, a soft line of drool catching on his chin. Rick didn't bother waking him. The boy's dreams were cleaner than reality, cleaner than his. Outside, the galaxies passed like old faces, familiar, half-forgotten. Rick watched them the way an old man might watch the sea, knowing he could dive again but never reach the same shore. He sipped from a flask that had long gone dry. The motion was habit, not thirst. Every universe leads home, he muttered, hearing the echo of those other Ricks in his skull. Home. The word felt heavier now, too wide to fit anywhere. He wondered if there'd ever been one for him in the first place. Something flickered across the viewport, a trail of light bending where it shouldn't. Rick frowned and adjusted the sensors. It wasn't debris and it wasn't a ship. The readings came back scattered, faint, almost shy. Temporal ghost, he whispered. Or maybe just another memory. Morty stirred at the sound, mumbling in his sleep. Rick smiled faintly. For a moment, the expression made him look almost human again. He turned back to the console, tapping in a few commands. The ship shifted course toward the anomaly, a ripple in the dark shaped like a heartbeat. As they neared, the light solidified into something strange, like a door hanging in the middle of space, edges glowing with the soft blue of old dreams. Rick's hand hovered over the controls. His voice was low, nearly tender. You've got one more mistake left in you, old man. He pressed the switch. The door opened. A wash of light filled the cabin, warm and weightless. Morty jerked awake. Rick, what's happening? Rick didn't answer. The light wrapped around them like water. Then everything was gone. When Morty blinked again, he was standing in a field. The air smelled of rain and static. Grass stretched in all directions under a silver sky. In the distance stood a house. A version of the Smith home, though softer around the edges. Its paint too perfect. Its windows glowing faintly from within. Morty's heart thudded. Rick, where are we? Rick didn't move. His face was unreadable. We're somewhere between memory and math. A holding pattern. A world built from what I almost understood. Morty frowned. You mean you made this? Rick's gaze darkened. I think so. But maybe it made itself. I've built so many fail-safes I can't tell where I end anymore. They walked toward the house. The closer they came, the heavier the air felt. Like walking through syrup. The sound of crickets rose and fell, but the rhythm was too perfect, looped seamless. At the door, Rick hesitated. His fingers brushed the handle like it might remember him. This is where it started, he said quietly. Inside, the house was full of light. Photographs lined the walls. Rick and Beth, young and smiling. Rick holding baby Morty. The garage unfinished, half-built like a dream, still deciding what it wanted to be. Morty looked around, voice small. This isn't real, is it? Rick shook his head no, but it's kinder than the truth. They moved through the rooms in silence. Each one felt like a confession, versions of moments that never happened, but maybe could have. On the kitchen table lay 2 sandwiches, untouched, still warm. Morty reached out. Rick, someone's here. Rick didn't stop him this time. A voice floated from the next room. Hey, Dad. Rick froze. Beth stood in the doorway smiling. Not the Beth they knew. This one was younger, softer, her eyes bright with a kind of belief he'd long since burned away. Been waiting for you, she said. Morty looked between them. Rick. Rick swallowed hard. Not her. Just a reconstruction. Beth tilted her head. Does that make it less real? Her tone wasn't accusing. It was gentle, curious. The way a child might ask why the stars blink. Rick couldn't look at her. I made you from fragments, he said finally. Bits of memory and regret stitched together in an old backup drive. You shouldn't exist. Beth smiled faintly. Then why do you keep coming back? Rick exhaled, a sound halfway between a laugh and a sigh. Because I'm an idiot. They stood there for a long time, the air humming quietly between them. Morty shifted, eyes wet but unsure why. There was something in the way Beth looked at Rick like she forgave him, even for things he hadn't confessed yet. Finally, she spoke. You can rest here for a while. The storms haven't started yet. Rick nodded slowly. Yeah, maybe a while. They ate the sandwiches in silence. The taste was simple. Bread, salt, memory. Morty felt himself relaxing in a way he hadn't since The Verge. His eyelids grew heavy. The hum of the house was like a lullaby sung by walls. He looked at Rick, who sat staring out the window. Rick, if this is a memory, what happens when we leave? Rick didn't look at him. Then it fades. That's what memories do, Morty. But what if we stay? Rick's voice dropped to a whisper. Then we forget. Morty didn't answer. The sky outside had begun to change, clouds drifting in slow spirals, colors bending in soft, impossible ways. It looked like time itself was sighing. Beth rose and placed a hand on Rick's shoulder. You can't fix it all, Dad. He turned toward her, eyes tired. I'm not trying to, just trying to stop breaking it. Beth smiled. Then you're already closer than before. Her form began to shimmer, faint and translucent. Rick reached for her instinctively, but his hand passed through light. Wait, Beth. She leaned forward, her voice barely audible. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room to be loved. Then she was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air seemed to pause, holding its breath for him. And Morty wiped his face. Rick, I'm sorry. Rick didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at the space she'd been. After a while, he whispered, That line wasn't in the code. Morty frowned. What do you mean? Rick turned toward him, eyes glassy, but alive. I didn't write that, which means maybe she wasn't just data. Outside, thunder rolled softly, more like a memory of thunder than the sound itself. Rick took a deep breath. We need to go before this place closes. Morty nodded reluctantly. Together they stepped outside, the grass bending under invisible wind. The door behind them dissolved into light. As they walked back toward where the ship should have been, Morty looked up. Hey, Rick. Yeah? What did she mean? That you don't have to be the smartest person to be loved. Rick smiled faintly, a tired, fragile smile. She meant that maybe the point of all this wasn't to understand everything, just to care about something anyway. They found the ship waiting in the tall grass, its form flickering at the edges, half transparent. Rick climbed in first, pressing a few buttons to stabilize the return vector. As the engines came online, Morty looked back. The field was fading, the house already gone. All that remained was a single tree, standing alone beneath the silver sky. When they lifted off, its leaves shimmered one last time, scattering into the air like soft sparks. Rick didn't speak as they left orbit. His eyes stayed on the monitor, but his mind was somewhere else, somewhere quieter, softer. The universe outside stretched endlessly, but inside the cabin it felt still. After a long silence, Morty said softly, "Rick, I think she was real. Maybe not in a way we understand, but real enough." Rick glanced at him, a hint of something breaking through the usual mask. "Yeah, Morty. Real enough." The stars shifted around them, folding back into the familiar rhythm of the cosmos. The hum of the engine deepened into something gentle, like breathing. Rick leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for the first time in what felt like centuries. For once, he didn't dream of running. He just drifted, carried by the same quiet current that had always been there, beneath the equations, beneath the noise leading him somewhere he'd stopped believing existed. Home. Maybe, or whatever came after. The ship drifted through a part of space Rick had once mapped and then deliberately erased. He didn't remember doing it, but the absence felt familiar, the way an old scar might ache in changing weather. The stars here were softer, almost shy, their light diffused like candle smoke through deep blue mist. Morty sat beside him, quiet, chin resting against his sleeve. They hadn't spoken since leaving the field. Maybe neither knew what words could fit anymore. Rick's hand hovered over the console, not typing, not building, just resting. The gesture looked foreign on him. There was always something he could fix, always a project waiting, but now every thought of construction felt like noise. The silence was beginning to feel like the only truth left. Morty broke it first. "Rick, do you ever wonder if maybe you were supposed to stop a long time ago?" Rick looked at him, then back at the stars. "You mean stop moving?" "Yeah, like, maybe we already passed where we were supposed to end up." Rick let the question sit between them. "If we passed it," he said finally, "then maybe that means it wasn't the right place. Or maybe we just weren't ready to recognize it." Morty frowned. "And if we never find it?" Rick smiled faintly, not cruelly, but with the weariness of someone who had asked that same question 1,000 times. "Then we make somewhere else feel like enough." The ship's lights dimmed as they entered a gravity swell, not dangerous, just strange. The stars outside rippled, bending as if reflected on water. Through the distortion, Morty thought he saw outlines of things that weren't quite there. Silhouettes of people standing on nothing, shapes resembling homes, laughter echoing without mouths to hold it. "What is this place?" Morty whispered. Rick adjusted a dial, his voice soft. "It's called the Drift, a memory current, formed by dying universes. They bleed their leftover thoughts into the vacuum." Morty's eyes widened. "You mean we're inside what's left of other realities?" "Yeah," Rick said. "The forgotten parts, the dreams, the what-ifs, the near misses, the stuff even death doesn't bother collecting." The sound around them changed. Less mechanical, more human. Faint voices hummed through the hull, not speaking words, just sighing softly, endlessly. Morty shivered. "They sound sad." Rick shook his head. "They're not sad, Morty. They're peaceful. This is what existence sounds like when it stops trying." They floated for a long time like that. The ship suspended in the soft blue light, surrounded by the echoes of 1,000 quiet endings. It was beautiful in a way that felt too big for language. After a while, Morty stood and walked to the viewport, pressing his palm against the glass. "It's weird, Rick. All these worlds, people, versions of us, and none of them lasted." Rick joined him, his reflection beside the boys. "Nothing lasts, Morty. That's the point. The trick isn't to make it last. It's to make it matter before it doesn't." Morty nodded slowly, eyes glistening in the dim light. "You think we did that?" Rick hesitated. His answer was quieter than usual. "Sometimes, not always. But tonight feels close." They stood there in silence, watching fragments of broken universes drift past, pieces of old ships, pieces of planets, and once the faint outline of a park bench with two figures carved in static light. Rick froze when he saw it. "Rick? What is it?" He didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer to the glass, hand trembling slightly. That looks like where I used to sit with her." Morty frowned. "Her who?" Rick exhaled. "Diane." The name hung in the cabin like a confession. Morty had heard it before, always whispered, always cut short by a drink or a curse. The bench passed closer. Two figures shimmered faintly, a woman and a younger Rick, both caught mid-laughter, frozen in time. Her face was blurred, as if memory itself had gone soft around the edges. Morty whispered, "Rick, is that really her?" Rick didn't blink. "No, just a residue. But it's enough." For the first time in what felt like forever, Rick didn't analyze or dissect. He just looked. The moment wasn't science. It was ache, a quiet ache that stretched between what he was and what he could have been. When the bench finally dissolved into the blue, he let out a slow breath. "You ever wonder, Morty," he said, voice almost breaking, "if maybe love is the one constant, but only because it refuses to disappear even when everything else does?" Morty's voice was barely a whisper. "Maybe that's what makes it real." Rick smiled faintly. "Smart kid." The hum of the drift deepened. The light began to shift, swirling faster, like the universe was exhaling around them. A low tone filled the ship, gentle but insistent. Rick glanced at the sensors. "Something's pulling us in. A gravity knot. Not physical. Conceptual." Morty blinked. "Conceptual?" Rick's voice steadied. "It means we're being pulled toward an idea." The pull grew stronger. The lights flickered, and suddenly the cabin dissolved around them. They stood in a vast space of golden fog. The ground was glassy, reflecting constellations that moved beneath their feet. Rick looked down and realized each light below was a moment, fragments of his life playing silently. His inventions, his failures, Morty's laughter, Beth's eyes, Bird Person's flight, the endless multiverse looping like an unfinished equation. Morty stared in awe. "What is this place?" Rick looked up at the endless horizon. "It's what's left when a mind stops running from itself." A figure appeared ahead, walking toward them through the haze. It looked like Rick, older, softer, with eyes that had stopped trying to be clever. Morty stepped back. "Another version?" Rick's voice dropped. "No, this one's me." The older Rick smiled gently. "Took you long enough." Rick swallowed hard. "So this is it, the end of the maze." "Not the end," the older version said. "Just the place where the walls stop mattering." They faced each other for a long time, mirror in reflection. Morty whispered, "Rick, what's happening?" Rick didn't take his eyes off the figure. "I think I'm forgiving myself." The older Rick nodded slowly, and as he did, the fog began to brighten. The two Ricks stepped closer until their forms overlapped, one dissolving into the other, light blending into light. Morty shielded his eyes. When he looked again, there was only one Rick, his Rick, standing quietly, eyes clear, shoulders no longer heavy. Rick turned to him. "Guess that was overdue." Morty smiled through the glow. "You feel better?" Rick chuckled. "Better's a strong word, but I feel lighter." The golden light faded back into stars. The ship returned around them, systems rebooting with a soft hum. The drift was gone, replaced by open space again. Vast, calm, unthreatening. Morty looked out at the void. "Where do we go now?" Rick leaned back, folding his hands behind his head. "Doesn't matter. The point wasn't the destination. It was getting okay with not knowing." Morty laughed quietly. "That's the most un-Rick thing you've ever said." Rick smirked. "Yeah, well, maybe I'm not the same Rick anymore." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars drift by. There was no rush now, no mission to finish, no mistake to fix, just the rhythm of existence. Steady, unremarkable, beautiful. After a long pause, Morty said, "You think the universe ever falls asleep?" Rick looked out the window, eyes soft. "Maybe it does, Morty. Maybe that's what we're hearing when we stop talking, the sound of the universe dreaming." Morty smiled, leaning back in his seat. "Then I guess we should let it dream." Rick nodded slowly. "Yeah, we should." Outside, the stars pulsed faintly as if agreeing. The ship drifted on, its path uncharted, its purpose simple, to keep moving gently through whatever waited next. Neither spoke again. Rick closed his eyes, and for the first time in a long, long while, he didn't feel the need to wake up. The universe hummed softly, wrapping them both in its quiet lullaby. The sound of endings turning softly into beginnings. The sound of love refusing to fade. And in that silence, they finally rested. The sound came first, not mechanical, not cosmic, but faintly organic, like the low pulse of something ancient stirring in its sleep. Rick's eyes opened to a horizon that wasn't there before. The ship was still drifting. But outside, the stars had gathered into strange formations, curling into slow-moving spirals of light that resembled living veins. Space itself seemed to breathe, drawing them forward with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Morty was still asleep, slumped against the co-pilot's chair, his mouth half open, his breathing steady. Rick didn't wake him. For once, he didn't want to. The boy looked peaceful in a way Rick hadn't seen since before all this began, before the portals, before the losses, before everything turned into survival and guilt. Rick reached for the console and dimmed the lights further. The cabin glowed faintly in the rhythm of the stars outside. There was no sound from the ship, not even the hum of engines. It was coasting, almost suspended, as though caught in a dream's gravity. He whispered to himself, "Where the hell are we now?" But the ship didn't answer. It didn't need to. The view outside shifted, the spirals of light converged, forming a single point in the distance, faint but undeniable. Something was calling. Not with sound, with memory. He stood slowly, his joints creaking in the quiet, and stepped closer to the glass. The point of light flickered, white, then gold, then soft blue. It pulsed like a heartbeat. Rick's reflection stared back at him. Older than he remembered, tired in ways that had nothing to do with time. He leaned against the frame and sighed. You never quit, do you? A voice, quiet but unmistakable, echoed through the cabin. You didn't either. Rick froze. It wasn't Morty. It wasn't the ship. It was softer, familiar. He turned slowly. Standing near the back of the cabin, shimmering like the edges of a fading hologram, was a woman. Her outline flickered, golden at the edges, her features blurred by light, but he knew the shape of her voice before his brain dared to name it. Diane, he whispered. She smiled faintly, the way she always had when he said her name, as if it was something fragile he wasn't supposed to hold. You've been running for a long time, Rick. His throat tightened. This isn't real. Does it matter? She asked, stepping closer. You've been everywhere else. Maybe now it's time to come here. Rick backed against the console, staring. His heart thudded in slow disbelief. He'd seen hallucinations before. Clones, projections, alternate timelines, but nothing felt like this. This wasn't a trick. This felt like gravity. Diane tilted her head. You thought you could forget me by outrunning everything that reminded you of me, but all you did was carry me into every universe you entered. Rick swallowed hard. You're not real, he said again, weaker this time. She smiled sadly. Then stop pretending I have to be. Outside, the light grew brighter, flooding the cabin with warmth. Morty stirred, blinking. Rick, what's going on? Rick's voice cracked. Stay back, Morty. Diane turned toward the boy, her form flickering. You brought him far, farther than anyone else. Morty blinked, staring. Rick, who is she? Rick hesitated, then forced the word out like a confession. My wife.
Morty froze.
Rick didn't let him finish. He turned away, pressing his palms to his eyes. She's gone, Morty. Been gone a long time. Diane's voice softened. Gone doesn't mean forgotten. Rick snapped. Don't do that. Don't talk like you're real. But Diane only smiled, her form brightening as if lit by his rage. You think everything has to be real to matter? You still don't get it. Morty stepped closer, his voice trembling. Rick, maybe you should. Stay out of this. Rick barked, then immediately regretted it. Morty froze, hurt flashing across his face. But before Rick could say more, Diane spoke again. You built universes to replace the one you broke. You tried to turn pain into science, grief into equations. But all you built was distance. Rick turned slowly toward her. His voice shook. What was I supposed to do, huh? Just stop? Sit in the ashes and let it eat me alive? Diane looked at him for a long moment. You were supposed to live, not run. The words hit like a physical blow. He staggered back, breath catching. The cabin flickered. The stars outside shifting, spinning faster, their light wrapping around the ship like a spiral shell. The heartbeat rhythm quickened. Morty held onto the chair to keep balance. Rick, the readings are going crazy. Rick didn't answer. He stepped toward Diane, trembling. If you're really her, if this is really you, why now? She smiled gently, because you finally stopped fighting long enough for me to reach you. The light flared, flooding the cabin. Morty shielded his eyes. When he looked again, Rick and Diane were standing close, the glow around them blurring the edges of space itself. Rick's voice broke. I wasn't ready to lose you. I know, she whispered. But you did, and that's okay. He shook his head, eyes wet. No, it's not. I kept trying to fix it. Every world I built, every choice I made, it all came back here. That's because this, she said softly, placing her hand over his chest, was the one place you never rebuilt. Rick's breath caught. He looked down, her hand glowed faintly through him, her touch not warm, not cold, just there. You were always enough, she said. You just forgot. For a long time, neither moved. The ship hummed around them, caught in the pulse of the universe's quiet breathing. Then Diane began to fade, the edges of her light unraveling. Rick's voice broke again. Don't go. She smiled through the glow. You finally stopped running, Rick. You don't need me to stay. I'll always need you. I know, she whispered. That's why I can leave. And with that, she dissolved, not gone in a burst, but like mist slowly drawn into morning air. Rick fell to his knees, silent. The cabin dimmed. Morty approached cautiously, kneeling beside him. Rick? Rick didn't answer. His eyes were wet but steady, staring at the spot where she'd stood. For once, he wasn't hiding behind sarcasm or science. There was just silence. Morty sat next to him, unsure what to say. After a while, he spoke softly. You okay? Rick exhaled shakily. No, but maybe that's the point. They sat like that for a long time. Two silhouettes against a slowly dimming galaxy. Outside, the light that had pulled them began to fade. The stars returned to their ordinary positions, the spirals dissolving back into stillness. Rick eventually stood, wiping his face with the back of his hand. We should go. Morty nodded. Where to? Rick looked at the console, then at the stars. Doesn't matter. Let's just see what's left. He took the controls. The ship hummed back to life, gentle and sure. They rose out of the light's remains, cutting through a sky that now felt open again, no longer heavy, no longer haunted. Morty looked back one last time. You think she's still out there somewhere? Rick didn't look up. Maybe. Or maybe she's just here. He tapped his chest. That's enough. The stars drifted wider as they accelerated. The darkness didn't feel empty anymore. It felt vast, patient, alive. Morty leaned back, closing his eyes. Feels like the universe got quieter. Rick's voice was soft. Maybe it finally doesn't need to scream to get our attention. They flew on, silent, through the endless hum of the cosmos. Rick's hand hovered near the controls, then rested against the glass, tracing a faint pattern, the curve of a spiral, the memory of light. He whispered, almost to himself, "Goodbye, Diane." The ship vanished into the horizon, swallowed by stars, two souls adrift, no longer lost, just moving forward, slow and infinite, toward whatever waited beyond the next dawn of creation. The universe, for all its infinite noise, had never felt this quiet. Rick and Morty drifted through a stretch of space where stars were few and time itself seemed to hesitate. It wasn't dark exactly, more like the afterglow of something that had recently ended. The kind of silence left behind when a song fades, and the echo still hums in your chest. Rick sat back in the pilot's chair, staring at the readings that barely flickered anymore. The instruments pulsed softly, almost respectfully, as if they too sensed that this was a moment not to disturb. Morty sat cross-legged beside him, head resting against the side panel, watching the faint glitter of distant galaxies blink in and out of sight like breathing. "How long's it been?" Morty asked after what felt like hours.
Rick didn't look up.
Since what? Since whatever that was. Rick exhaled slow and deep, long enough to start pretending it didn't happen. Morty gave a quiet laugh, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You really think pretending works?" "It does until it doesn't," Rick said. "That's usually good enough for me." They sat in the dimness a while longer, the ship coasting on minimal power. Every now and then a flicker of static shimmered across the console, a distant signal trying to break through. Rick didn't bother checking. He'd chased signals all his life. Some led to discoveries, most led to disappointments. Tonight he wanted neither. After some time, Morty stirred. "You know, Rick, that thing, that light or whatever, it didn't feel bad." Rick's gaze didn't move from the stars. "Wasn't supposed to." "Then what was it?" Rick hesitated, his fingers drumming against the armrest. "Call it unfinished business. The kind the universe doesn't let you bury until you look it in the eye." Morty frowned, but it looked like her, like someone real. Rick's voice softened. Sometimes memory gets tired of waiting to be remembered, so it builds itself out of whatever light's lying around. Morty watched him closely. There was a weariness in Rick now that wasn't physical. Something deeper, older.
You miss her, huh?
Rick didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the quiet beyond the glass. Every version of me misses her, even the ones that don't admit it. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was almost sacred. The kind of pause people take when words are too clumsy to hold what they feel. Outside, a faint aurora shimmered through the void, like threads of silk unraveling in slow motion. Morty tilted his head. "You think she's really gone?" Rick chuckled under his breath. "Kid, nothing's ever really gone. It just changes form, turns into starlight, heat, noise, regret, take your pick." When Morty thought about that, "That's kinda sad." Rick shrugged. "It's kinda beautiful too, if you stop expecting it to be fair." The ship glided onward. For a while, Morty dozed off, his head resting on his arm. Rick let him sleep. Outside, the glow of distant nebulas rippled like ocean waves caught in slow motion. He reached for his flask, but stopped halfway. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like numbing anything. He just wanted to remember. He leaned back and closed his eyes. Behind him, he saw her face again. Not in light this time, but in memory. The way Diane would tilt her head when she listened. The quiet laughter that never tried to fill silence. The way she'd always known he was running from something even before he did. Rick whispered, almost inaudible, "You'd laugh if you saw me now." The home of the ship responded with a low vibration, like an old friend sighing in agreement. When Morty woke, Rick was still at the console. The stars had shifted again, a faint golden cluster ahead pulsing softly like a heartbeat. Morty rubbed his eyes. Where are we now? Rick smirked faintly. Edge of nowhere. My favorite neighborhood. Morty leaned forward, squinting. That cluster, it looks familiar. Rick's eyes narrowed. Yeah, it should. As they drew closer, the cluster began to take shape. A network of small orbiting stations, their lights flickering in rhythmic patterns. It was one of Rick's old projects, long abandoned, half forgotten. The Citadel of Forgotten Ricks. Morty stared in quiet awe. I thought this place got destroyed. Rick's tone was flat. It did. Or maybe it didn't. Multiverses have a nasty habit of recycling their mistakes. They descended slowly, the ship gliding through debris fields of fractured metal and shattered glass. Some structures still blinked with faint power, like ghosts that hadn't realized they were dead. As the ship touched down, Morty's voice trembled. You sure about this? No, Rick said, standing. But when did that ever stop me? I stepped out onto the platform. The air shimmered faintly, not quite atmosphere, not quite vacuum. It smelled like static and old dreams. The halls were empty, echoing with the memory of voices that once argued, laughed, conspired. Morty looked around, whispering, Feels like walking through a graveyard. Rick's expression didn't change. That's because it is. They wandered deeper into the ruins. Occasionally screens flickered to life, old data logs, fragments of alternate selves. On one wall, Rick saw a reflection of himself recorded decades ago, eyes burning with ambition, voice sharp and arrogant. He muttered, Look at you! Thought you could outsmart grief. Morty watched quietly. You think they were all like you? Rick turned to him. No. That's the point. They were all like them. Versions that never learned when to stop. They kept walking until they reached a chamber at the far end of the station, a large circular room with a cracked dome revealing the endless stars above. At its center stood a console still faintly humming, coated in dust. Rick approached it slowly, his hand brushing the surface. This was where it started. The idea that maybe I could make it all mean something again. Morty asked softly, Did it? Rick looked up at the stars through the broken glass. It meant something to her. Maybe that's enough. He powered the console. The lights flickered weakly, displaying a faint hologram, a swirling archive of thousands of memories, fractured timelines, unfinished equations. Morty whispered, What is that? Rick's eyes softened, everything I couldn't let go of. He hesitated, then reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small silver chip, the kind used for data backups. He turned it in his hand, watching it catch the light. This one's new. Morty frowned. What's on it? Rick smiled faintly. The part where I finally stopped trying to fix everything. He slid the chip into the console. The hologram pulsed once, then began to dissolve. One by one, the glowing fragments vanished, like stars slipping below a horizon. Morty's eyes widened. You're deleting it? Rick nodded. No more replicas. No more reboots. Let the ghost rest for once. As the last fragments faded, the console dimmed and a soft hum filled the chamber. Low, peaceful, final. Rick exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in years. There, now it's just quiet. Morty looked up at him. Feels weird, huh? Rick smiled tiredly. Yeah, feels like living. They stood together, gazing through the cracked dome. The stars outside shimmered like old memories being rewritten, not gone, just softer. Morty leaned on the rail. So what now? Rick chuckled softly. Now we drift. Maybe find a planet with bad coffee and good sunsets. Maybe just float until the stars forget our names. Morty grinned. That doesn't sound too bad. Rick turned to him, his expression warm, almost fatherly. Kid, after everything, I'll take not too bad. The light around them dimmed to a soft gold somewhere deep in the structure. A final circuit failed, and the station's hum faded to silence. Rick looked out one last time and whispered, Goodnight, old man. Then they returned to the ship. As the engines ignited, the Citadel collapsed behind them, not in an explosion, but in a slow, graceful crumble dissolving into starlight. Rick didn't look back. They flew forward into the quiet, their path lit only by the faint reflection of what once was, and the steady promise of what might still be. The stars had thinned into mist by the time Rick and Morty reached the edge of the last charted cluster. Space wasn't black anymore. It had turned pale, like the inside of a seashell, shimmering faintly with ghost colors. The ship moved slower now, as if it too had grown tired of rushing. Every hum of its engine was softer, every movement drawn out, like a deep breath before sleep. Morty sat near the viewport, chin in his hands, eyes tracing the light trails left behind by meteor dust. He didn't speak much anymore. Neither did Rick. They'd run out of questions that needed answers, and for the first time, silence wasn't heavy between them. It was peaceful. Rick leaned back in the chair, one arm draped over the backrest, the other holding a cooling mug of coffee he'd made 3 hours ago. He didn't drink it. He just liked the smell. You ever think, he murmured, not looking away from the stars, that maybe the universe isn't expanding, just remembering? Morty blinked, half asleep. Remembering? Yeah, Rick said. Like every spark of light's a memory, and all this emptiness is the space between thoughts. Morty smiled faintly. That's kinda nice, Rick. Weird, but nice. Rick chuckled. Yeah, don't get used to it. Sentimental talk's a symptom of either peace or death. Not sure which we've hit yet. They drifted for hours like that. No destinations, no coordinates, just a ship, a boy, and a man who'd finally run out of universes to hide in. Eventually, they landed on a small, unnamed planet that appeared as a soft blue dot on the scanner. It was quiet, blanketed in fog that shimmered with static. The air was warm, breathable, faintly metallic. The ground under their boots felt spongy, like stepping on the surface of a dream. Morty took a deep breath, exhaling with a low whistle. Smells clean, like nothing. Rick nodded, glancing around. Yeah, probably the closest thing to neutral this side of infinity. They walked without purpose, following the slope of a shallow valley that opened into a field of tall silver grass. The blades swayed slowly, though there was no wind. Each one caught the light in a different color, rippling like water made of memory. Morty bent down, touching one. It's warm. Rick crouched beside him, scanning it with his wrist device. The reading came back blank. No data. Not alive. Not dead. Just existing. Morty smiled. Guess that makes 3 of us. Rick huffed out a quiet laugh. Not bad, kid. You're starting to get it. They found a rise at the edge of the field overlooking a pale sea that moved like liquid glass. Rick sat first, setting the flask down beside him. Morty joined, hugging his knees. For a long time, neither spoke. The sea whispered faintly, making no real sound, just a pattern that felt like it could be one if you listened long enough. Rick, Morty said quietly, do you ever think about all the other versions of us? Like the ones that didn't make it this far? Rick leaned back on his hands. Sometimes, but I stopped pretending I could tell the difference. Every version's a memory of a choice. We're just the one that kept walking. Morty nodded slowly. So, what happens now? Rick looked at the sea. Its surface shimmered with faint reflections that weren't theirs. Shadows of past moments flickering like dreams trying to stay awake. Now, we rest. Maybe we forgive ourselves a little. Maybe we stop asking the universe to explain itself. Morty picked up a stone from the ground and threw it. It skipped once, twice, then sank without a sound. You think Mom would forgive you? If she knew everything? Rick didn't answer for a while. His gaze softened, the corners of his eyes lined with something almost fragile. If she were anything like her mother, yeah, she'd forgive me before I asked. Morty looked down. I think she already did. The air grew still. Rick reached into his coat and pulled out a small object wrapped in fabric. He unfolded it slowly. It was a locket, old, dented, the metal dulled with time. Inside was a photo, a younger Rick, hair less gray, eyes more alive, with Diane beside him, her smile small but real. Between them, a tiny laughing baby, Beth. Morty leaned closer. Wow, you've kept that all this time? Rick's voice was low. Yeah, not in any pocket that mattered, but I never left it behind. He held it for a moment longer, then closed it gently and set it on the ground beside him. The grass around it shimmered faintly, as if recognizing something sacred. Morty asked, You gonna leave it here? Rick nodded. Yeah, feels like the right kind of place. Quiet, forgetful. They sat watching the sea until the stars began to appear, slowly, shyly, like old friends sneaking back into view. Morty whispered, You ever think we'll see her again? Rick smiled faintly, eyes on the horizon. Kid, if the universe is half as stubborn as she was, she'll find a way. A long silence passed, filled only by the rhythm of their breathing and the soft shimmer of the air. Morty eventually lay back on the grass, hands behind his head. It's weird, I feel like I should be sad, but I'm not. Rick mirrored him, lying beside him. That's called peace, Morty. You don't get it often. When you do, you don't question it. They stared up at the sky together. The constellations shifted slowly, rearranging themselves into patterns that looked familiar. Loops, spirals, shapes from forgotten dreams. Morty yawned. Rick? Yeah. Thanks for not leaving me behind. Rick turned his head slightly, his tone soft. You think I could have done any of this without you, kid? Morty chuckled sleepily. You'd have tried? Rick smirked. Yeah, and I'd have failed. spectacularly. The stars above pulsed brighter. For a moment, Rick thought he saw the faint outline of Diane's face in them, smiling, patient, fading back into light. He whispered, "Yeah, I see you." Morty's eyes were closed now, his breathing slow, even. "Rick," he mumbled, "you think this is it? Like, the end of everything?" Rick watched him for a while, then looked back at the sky. Nah, endings are just lazy beginnings. He reached over, tugging Morty's blanket over his shoulders. "Sleep, Morty. You've earned it." The boy murmured something inaudible and drifted off. Rick stayed awake a little longer. He took one last sip of the now cold coffee, then set the mug down beside the locket. The stars continued their quiet dance above him, the universe breathing slow, steady breaths. He thought about all the versions of himself, the cruel ones, the lost ones, the ones who thought power meant purpose. He thought about the boy sleeping beside him, who had somehow remained kind through it all. And he thought about Diane, the memory that had waited across light years for him to stop running. "Guess we made it, huh?" he whispered to the night. "Not perfect, but here." The wind, or whatever passed for it on this world, shifted gently through the silver grass, carrying a faint hum. It almost sounded like a voice, distant, loving, saying something that didn't need to be heard to be understood. Rick closed his eyes. The sound of the sea folded into the rhythm of his heartbeat. For once he didn't dream of inventions or universes or the past. He dreamed of stillness, of home. Above them, the stars shimmered in gentle loops, as if tracing the outline of an old, invisible lullaby. And somewhere in that endless quiet, in the spaces between galaxies, a soft light flickered one last time, like a goodbye or maybe a welcome. Rick smiled in his sleep. "Thanks for spending this time with us," he murmured faintly, the words barely escaping his lips. "Sleep well. Everything's gonna be okay, man." The waves shimmered once, the stars dimmed slightly, and the night settled into its eternal calm.